This program deals with themes of an adult nature and is intended for a mature audience.
If you like what you watch, then don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates on the KTPF Community Talk Show. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for our new weekly radio shows. To accompany the KTPF Community Talk Show, we now have our own free magazine to view online or download for free. Visit our website for more details. Also, the KTPF Community Talk Show is supported by Phenomenon Magazine and Beyond Parazine, available online now.
The KTPF Community Talk Show is sponsored by Dragonos Castle, South Wales, one of the most haunted castles in Wales. For more information on ghostly and ghastly events, including Fright Nights, all-night investigations and hen parties, visit www.mosthauntedcastle.com.
The comments and views expressed on the KTPF Community Talk Show are those of the people that make them and do not necessarily reflect the views of ourselves or of our sponsors.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
They've landed.
You're in the right place. Online, on the web, and on air. All over the world.
Talk radio.
You hear us, we hear you.
Hello and welcome to another KTPF, Keeping the Paranormal Friendly show. For this week only, it's just me, Andy, on my own. Steve and Sue are away on their wedding anniversary, 25th anniversary, celebrating up in Scotland for the weekend. So I'm afraid tonight you've got just me. Well, I say just me. In actual fact, you've got myself and a good friend of mine, Mr. Richard Ward, who's here as my guest for the evening. Tonight we're going to talk about various topics, starting off with talking about psychic questing, something that Richard and I have been involved in for a number of years. Then talk for a while perhaps about Richard, who's the book collector and second-hand bookseller that we mention and advertise on the show and in the magazine. And then perhaps later on we'll talk a bit more about the occult generally, perhaps slaying a few myths and maybe setting a few things right, hopefully. Basically, that's going to be the show this evening. Well, I'm going to have an attempt at giving you the paranormal events for you listing, but don't be surprised if it all goes completely wrong. And I might have one or two news stories, but don't expect the slick, high-run, wonderful show that Steve and Sue do every week, because they're not me, I'm not them, so I'm not quite as good as they are. But hopefully you'll enjoy this evening's discussion. So without further ado, I shall get on. Okay, thank you. I'm Andy, this is Richard, bloody blah. Those who've missed the beginning bit, I'm sorry, I do apologise. We introduce ourselves and each other. We are both very interested in the occult, have done for a number of years. We both met via a chap called Andy Collins, used to run a group called EarthQuest. It was like the founder of modern psychic questing, if you like. And we were just talking very briefly about a thing called The Black Alchemist, which was a book which we'll come on to a bit later on, that we're both interested in. And this chap here knows quite a bit more than even I do about this particular book. But I thought we'd start off by talking about what psychic questing is, Richard. So over to you.
Well, what psychic questing is I can only describe it as getting psychics out of the seance room and into the landscape, is the way Andy put it to me, and that is pretty accurate. It's really about using psychic faculties to solve historical enigmas and find hidden artefacts. And although it was Andrew Collins and Graham Phillips who really came up with the term in modern times and coined psychic questing as a term to describe that practice around about 1979-1980, the actual practice of psychic questing, albeit under a different name, has been going on probably since time immemorial. You've had people like Frederick Bligh-Baum, for example, who excavated the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey in the early 20th century, who got in touch through various mediums with the dead monks of Glastonbury to help him find various archaeological treasures there. There are also quite a few other similar accounts from the 20th century. There's another one, a guy called J. Hamlin Garland, who worked with psychics in America and went out being led to various sites to find some ancient Indian artifacts, which is all recorded. And also you've got other accounts in history, such as the Terma tradition amongst Tibetan monks, which has certainly been going back centuries and centuries. The whole Terma tradition was started by a guy called Padmasambhava, And that involves some very, very strange things where monks would be led out into the landscape to actually plunge their hands into things like waterfalls and even solid rock to pull out physical hidden artefacts. And also some of these artefacts are called mind termers, which are actually hidden texts or scrolls which would be again revealed to them by paranormal means. So psychic questing, although it retains in the modern day all of those parts of it, has actually been around for quite a long time.
Certainly, when I know quite a bit about the Glastonbury stuff as well as Blythebond and his original research work on the ruins of the Abbey. And I know that initially he kept very quiet about the source of his information.
Yes, because it was very, very controversial when he did actually, I can't remember when he actually got kicked off the archaeological dig at some point. I think he did at some point because they got wind of his methods and didn't really like it. It was all a little bit too dark and a little bit too occult for the authorities, I'm afraid.
One of the things you just mentioned about the Terpa business as well, the
Terma,
and it's kind of like thought form energy formation as well. Is that a similar kind of thing they were doing as well?
Kind related, but that's really a little bit different. You're probably talking more about tulpas, I think.
Tulpas, yes, that's the
rather than termas.
The only reason I mentioned it is something we came on the show a few weeks ago talking about possible explanations for the paranormal, for ghosts, etc. Could be these are generated thought forms. It's easy to say, but
yeah, it's certain. I would certainly agree that is one very, very valid point, and I mean. Ghosts, to be honest, I don't think anybody's ever really going to come up with a fundamental definitive answer of what they are, and they are probably an amalgam of lots of things like that. Partly place memory, partly what you've just been talking about.
Absolutely. So this was basically the background history of the genre, shall we say, of psychic questing. How did the sort of the modernised version with Andy come about?
Really, it was through when he met Graham Phillips, who was, a remarkable psychic and has also written a number of books, as Andy has. Obviously, you were speaking earlier, Andy, about sorry, trying to confuse the others. maybe I should call Andrew Collins for the purposes of this. Then we won't cause any confusion. But Andrew Collins met up with Graham Phillips. They put together a magazine called Parasearch around about 1978, 1979, and Graham started to realise that a lot of people had psychic traits and ended up putting together a list of things which he called psygenics. Which were psychic traits which a number of people who were very psychic tended to exhibit.
Oh, this is ringing bells. I remember him talking about it.
And he recorded this in, I think, one of the first Strange Phenomena magazines that the two of them put out at the time, around about 1979, 1980. And they decided to start working with these psychics and just see what would happen. And because they ended up going out, getting led to various places through dreams or visions to find historical enigmas, and in some cases later on uncover hidden artefacts. The first major one of which is revealed in Andrew's book The Seventh Sword, and also Graham Phillips's book, which he wrote with Martin Keatman, another guy who was involved at the time, which is called The Green Stone, in which they were led to find a talismanic green stone which was supposedly owned by Mary Queen of Scots. And they're actually led to do that by the finding of an ancient sword which was found in a bridge in Staffordshire.
I remember seeing a TV series, which I'm sure you've seen. I know we talked about it.
Oh, you're talking about The Strange Affair.
Yeah, Robert Symes.
Yes.
That was the first time I ever saw that. That would have been, I was probably still at school. So that was early 80s, wasn't it?
I can't remember that. It must have been early 80s, I think, or even late 70s possibly.
Well, I remember the Robert Symes show itself. I remember I was in the sixth form at school, post-school, so I would have been 17 years old. That would have been, 30 years ago.
Scary, when you think of it.
Absolutely, yeah. I never realised at that point I was going to get to know the guy reasonably well, who obviously was involved in the programme. So that was, I know that you've got the two different accounts, effectively. You've got Graham Phillips's The Greenstone, his account of the sword, and then Andy's Seventh Sword came out quite a bit later, but Andy's a much longer book, much more
involved. It is, obviously, Andy, I should say that Andy did, I think it was in a few years before the actual Seventh Sword came out, he did a little booklet called The Sword and the Stone, which kind of outlined
I've got that as well.
His take on the story, because unfortunately, due to some internal politics, Graham and Andy went their own way for a little while, and Graham Phillips continued writing books and also doing some psychic questing with Martin Keatman. and they went on to also do another book called The Eye of Fire, which was a talismanic red stone that they were led to find after the green stone. Whereas Andrew Collins, as we're keeping that name for tonight, met a very talented psychic in the 80s called Bernard, who sadly is no longer with us, and that led on to the whole Black Alchemist saga, which is undoubtedly Andy's most famous book.
I would say most certainly. Do you want to tell us a bit of the story of the Black Alchemist? I've just put Andrew Collins' website address on the chat. Pardon me, on the chat room. You can click on there and have a look at Andrew. We'll call him Andrew for the sake of confusion. Andrew's site, so it's just there. It is andrewcollins.com. It's quite easy to find. And interestingly enough, I was having a post-show chat with Scotty Roberts from last week's show, and it turns out Scotty and Andy actually know each other. And Andy's been a main speaker at some of their conferences in the last few years.
Oh yes,
yeah. Him, Scotty Roberts and John Ward are very much involved in Egyptology, and they did a thing about the Göbekli Tepe as well, so there was a obvious connection there. And I have to say, Scotty said that Andrew's book on Göbekli Tepe is probably the best one around, which is quite a compliment.
Yes, it certainly is. I mean, it's one of few so far published in English, I think, one of the first published in English, because the guy obviously who actually was doing, I forget the guy's name now, was actually doing the excavations at Göbekli Tepe. He did bring out his own book, but of course that wasn't available in English.
Right.
So yes, certainly I think Andy's is the most groundbreaking book, on the subject.
Well, hopefully someone can get Andrew on the show at some point in the future. But going back to the Black Alchemist, because this is what really intrigued me. Just to clear my own introduction to all of this, it turns out to be a mutual friend that we both know, a guy called Jason Roseman, who we both lost contact years ago, said to me, do you want to come along to this talk that Andrew Collins was giving? And I knew very little about it. I think Jason may have been to EarthQuest, or I somehow got involved, and there's another guy called Graham, not Graham, it's a different Graham. He was also there, and Graham and I became very good friends, and he was very much an occult collector like us. But I remember Andrew talking at the place called the Cue Ball at the time. It was our snooker club in Basildon. That was quite funny. I remember about 20 of us there. And I remember he gave us a chance to handle some of the artefacts that were mentioned in the Black Alchemist. I remember holding a particular piece of slate stone that had a symbol on which I knew as the Modus Hieroglyphica by John Dee, something we had talked about previously, and something I'm going to talk about on another show. But that was carved on the stone, and I remember the feeling from the stone was enormous. The energy coming from it. It was quite odd. I remember thinking at the time when I listened to Andrew talking, this all sounds like nonsense to me. It just sounded too much like a fairy story. But the artefacts, they had a massive feeling about them. Did you have a chance to examine them in any detail yourself?
Yes, I have done over the years, and certainly the original spearhead, which is the first Black Alchemist artefact, which was actually pulled out by Bernard out of Lullington Churchyard, a very, very small ancient churchyard in Sussex. Had a very, very strange vibe about it, and to be honest, I didn't really like handling them. And I should also perhaps point out at this point that there is a little bit of a differential between what we call black questing, which the Black Alchemist certainly falls into that category, and other types of quests, because within black quests there is a lot more real danger, both of a psychological and a physical nature to those taking part.
Actually, I can have one or two stories which I will do a bit later on, where I had some direct experience that was probably along the lines of black questing, which I've probably told you about before, the Canterbury Ring business. And
yes. No, I've had fun at Canterbury Ring as well.
We'll come back
just
to
one
that
of those
in a
places,
little
I think.
Yeah. But yeah, so can you give us a brief outline of the story? One of the reasons we were talking about the Black Alchemist is it is Andy's most famous book, or Andrew, we will call him Andrew, famous book. It has recently been republished, and it's sort of a chance to actually get hold of what was for a while quite a rare, quite expensive book to buy, but now freely available again, or readily available, which is not free, but readily available via Amazon.com. But yeah, so give us a rough idea of what on earth it was all about.
Well, really, it was the fact that this psychic Bernard picked up a lot of clues to this guy who they could only term the Black Alchemist because of what he was doing, which was actually going around various ancient sites in Essex and other parts of the southeast of Britain, and trying to literally take over the energy matrix of Britain, is what we think he was actually trying to do by planting these artefacts and trying to set up some kind of alchemical chain reaction. And there is no doubt that he was a very, very skilled individual in the fact that he was using techniques which certainly at the time were not readily available in English books.
I think this is predates the internet, anything like that.
Yes, it does, of course. Yeah, exactly. And there were very, very few books out at the time. Well, there have been quite a few come out since. Detailing stuff in the Greco Magical Papyri. which literally, you know, he was using these formulae, but they weren't really available at the time. And as you said, you know, quite right, Andy, you know, it's pre-internet days here, so it wasn't the fact that you could just go and look something up and, you know, and make it up.
And you know his local library didn't have many of these
No,
sort of books,
exactly.
did it?
I mean,
So-
whatever this guy was doing, he was, you know, doing it for a very, very serious purpose. He was going to too much effort not to, basically. And the whole idea was that Bernard would keep having these dreams about this black alchemist, and, you know, and contact Andy, and they would end up going out and they would end up finding these artifacts, but literally just being one step behind him, which is, of course, has, you know, led some people to suggest, was Bernard the black alchemist himself, although I can categorically say that that is not the case. I mean, Bernard was a married family man with his own business, sadly no longer with us, and there's just no way that he would have had time, you know, to have gone around the landscape planting all these artifacts in various places. You know, just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's a shame, as you say, he did pass away a few years ago. There was actually an audio recording that Andy made discussing the Black Alchemist with Bernard, which
Yes,
kind of basically resurfaced recently. I managed to encode it into MP3, and he sounds like Griff Rhys-Jones, doesn't he?
Yes, no, that was noted at the time, actually. Yes.
Similar
yes.
sort of sense of humour as well.
Yes,
I think,
yeah, oh yeah, he had a very, very dry sense of humour, Bernard. There's no doubt about that. I mean, you know, I was lucky enough to meet Bernard a few times when he was alive, and I found him an extremely erudite and extremely intelligent man. You know, and certainly didn't get any kind of vibe from him that he was in any way making any of this stuff up. You know, he seemed very, very, you know, sort of forthright and genuine.
Absolutely. I remember one of the events that everyone recalls that was kind of tied in at the time, of course, was the big storm in '87. So that kind of gives us a date of them, of course, when this game was all going on.
Well,
yes, some links in with that, wasn't there?
yes, yeah, of course. I mean, obviously, particularly down in Sussex, because there's been a lot of crossover between some quite dubious material relating to black magic, for want of a better word, in Sussex, and also the Black Alchemist saga. But I think really it was just purely a coincidental crossover there. But I mean, I went down in the wake of the hurricane in 1987. It was, wasn't it?
87, yeah, absolutely.
To Clapham Woods, to have a look around there, and the place certainly has got a very, very weird vibe to it. But I don't really think it can be, you know, linked to the Black Alchemist saga in any convincing way, apart from just the fact that there are, you know, sort of similarities there in terms of what people have been doing.
Well, interesting. Later on next month, we have got both separate shows. Charles Walker's coming on, who's kind of the expert, you would say, on Clapham Wood. And we should see what he has to say about it all, because obviously the idea of the link is interesting. And I think the following week is Stacey and Stuart from COTC, also based down in Sussex, who have their own sort of take on the whole Clapham Wood business. They've been involved themselves. I remember, funny enough, a story that Charles himself told me a little while ago when Andy invited him along to one of Andy's regular EarthQuest events. This was many years ago, and Charles got there slightly late. It was quite a large, I think it was the Medway Hall, was it called? Conway Hall, yeah. Quite a large place with quite a large back screen behind it, and Andy was talking as Charles walked in with a big picture of Charles on the screen, which came as quite a surprise to Charles at the time. He knew he was obviously being talked about, and that's why he'd been invited along, but I just walked in, there's my own picture, large life in front of it. But I remember the '87 storm. I was actually trying to walk home in the middle of the night in that, literally being blown along by it. But it was a nasty weather. So what was the kind of outcome, without giving the story away, of course, because obviously you want people to read the book still, but what was the kind of outcome of the Black Alchemist?
Well, I mean, gradually, Bernard decided to try and withdraw, basically, from the whole saga, which I think did mean that less and less was picked up by him. But then he did have, you know, sort of various threats to both himself and his family, more pertinently, which he did take seriously. And hence, when you start getting, you know, sort of cards threatening you coming through your actual home address door,
so he's actually this guy was sending things physically to it.
Yes, and also that there were messages left on the cars a couple of times when they came back from. I think it was Shenfield Common, and also one of the places in Danbury, which they were led to psychically to find out more about the Black Alchemist and what he was doing. That you know, people were trying to warn them off, you know, and it did seem quite serious.
I think Danbury was the most disturbed site. Danbury Churchyard, being more specific. I remember an occasion, again around about the same kind of time, where not long after the book had come out and we'd read it, and a few friends, we actually one summer's evening decided one of us to drive over to Danbury. And I remember it was a warm summer's night, and as soon as you walked into the churchyard at the back, it went bloody cold. It actually went physically cold, to the point one of the guys, Jim, decided he had enough already. Went back to the car, myself, Jason, and someone else, I can't remember who it was with us, so we decided to have a wander around. We didn't find anything, but certainly there was an odd atmosphere about it. But and then there were various things during the time of the Black Alchemist story that were found in the church. What sort of things were they finding?
Yeah, I mean, there was the heart, which was found in the roots of a tree, an animal heart.
The animal, not human. The stress,
Yes,
not human.
Yeah, not a human
If we went
heart,
that
yes,
far.
Yeah, with what is known as the ape dagger through it.
Oh, yes, yes.
Which is obviously done as part of some ritual. And then there was also a very, very ancient sort of Christ figure taken off a cross, also found in, I think, the roots of a tree that actually blown over as part of the Windsor Hurricane.
So do you think that was already there, or he placed it in there after it was blown over?
All we can say is that according to Bernard, who obviously found the artefact, he thinks it was placed there after it had been blown over. But
Obviously the heart was recent, it wouldn't have lasted. Whatever came with the daggers, Andy still got the parts?
yes, Andy still has. Yeah. I mean, I think Andy still has got, under lock and key somewhere. All the Black Alchemist artifacts.
Yeah.
And certainly as part of the one or two talks he did, previous to the relaunch of the book, he has taken them along for people to handle. He's still happy for people to do that.
I'd love to see them actually. I'll check next week. He's back home. He's abroad at the moment.
But just if you do that, just brush up your psychic protection first and wash your hands afterwards. Is all I can advise.
Absolutely. But, so what was the final kind of resolution with it, really? Did it all...
There wasn't really a final resolution. This is the problem. I mean, Bernard felt that the Black Alchemist was sort of had broadened his kind of mandate, if you like, and was actually going off round the world doing things. He was picking him up in locations as far apart as South America and France. But nobody really knows what, is happened to the guy. All the people that he was working with. I mean, all of that is, still unwritten, really.
It's going to come on to that. I mean, what do you know of the possibility of being involved with other people? I mean, I know one of the things that Charles Walker's angle was he was involved in the group that he'd been investigating called the Friends of Hecate, but again, whether that was because it had two disparate one group and a person acting around the same time, purely coincidentally it was at the same sort of time, or do you think there was a link there, or is there anything bigger than that?
It's difficult to say. I mean, I think it's probably coincidental, but I can see why, Charles and other people have, made the link between Andrew's Black Alchemist saga and, the Friends of Hecate stuff, because, there certainly are similarities, in some of the sites used, but not so much really in the methods, I would say.
Okay, fair enough. So, what have you been involved in yourself with psychic questioning that you can talk about?
Various bits and pieces over the years.
Well, what was the most unusual thing you've experienced?
The most unusual is probably the finding of the brass pillbox in a tomb in Danbury churchyard.
Oh, okay. Can you tell us the story behind that?
Well, basically, it was madness. We'd actually gone out, I think it was somewhere in Thundersley, trying to find an artefact as part of a quest, and we hadn't found it. And this is at the time when Andy was still married to his ex-wife, Sue. And we all came back home quite disillusioned, and after a couple of drinks we just got a bit silly and we thought, oh well, let's just see if we can make something up. So we ended up making up a box, what it looked like and what it contained, and didn't think any more of it until I started to have dreams about this box and started to think that it's somehow taken on a physical reality. To cut a long story short, I was at work one day. I was working for Dewson's the Builders Merchants at the time, and I can say this now because I've left and they can't get me in trouble for it. But I was looking for some kind of clue, and there are a lot of number synchronicities coming up at the time around the number 333, which we might need to explain a bit more about later to say what exactly that means in Hebrew gematria and other things. But a guy came in to put some stuff on his building account, and I couldn't find the account anywhere online, and he just said, type in 333. So I did that, and it came straight up. And also I noted that he was on the same road that my grandmother lived, in Malden as well, and I just thought, well, the 333 has come up, that's very, very odd. And then just something happened, it switched something in my head, and I felt very, very dizzy, and I felt that we would be able to get this artefact if we went out on a specific day to Danbury churchyard, and it had to be at a specific time. I ended up taking the rest of that day off of work. I said I felt ill, went home and felt that we should go out at 3:33 that afternoon. And indeed we did, and we managed to locate the tomb where I felt this artefact was. I put my hand in to try and find it and couldn't find anything. I was just starting to get those feelings of disillusionment again. As I was pulling my hand out, it was almost out from the tomb. At the stroke of 3:33, we heard something metallic drop. And it was nowhere near where my hand was at the time. Andrew rather I should say, quickly thrust his hand back in, had a feel around, and ended up pulling out this brass box exactly as we described, with 4 angelic heads on the top, some carvings on the bottom, and also had a very, very strange smell about it as well, a flowery smell of some sort of, as if it had some sort of embalming fluid in it. But that, to be honest, is probably the thing that really screwed with my head the most, because up until that point it was like we had made this thing up, but then perhaps more research needs to be done on the fact that you can actually create your own reality.
Well, it's
and I think in some way that we had created that reality and managed to pull it into physical manifestation. That's all I can say. I mean, I literally have no answers for it, no concrete answers.
Well, that comes back to what we were saying before, the thought forms before that, and of course the generating objects.
Yes.
Apports things appearing out of the book. I remember an occasion, because Earthquest used to meet once a month in Leon Sea, and in fact I know there was a possibility of restarting. It's been put forward many times. One day
about a year ago it was going to be kicking off again, but unfortunately it hasn't done.
Yes, now I remember specifically this occasion we used to have a talk about something or other, and we'd have a group meditation together, and there was a candle in the middle, and I can remember to this day there was a light. I don't think you were there. You probably were too there. Most of them you could miss.
I think from about 1989 onwards I was...
Do you remember this little blue stone appearing?
No, I don't remember.
I'm sure I remember something. It was like a little light by the candle, and then when we turned the light, there was it sounded like a bit of glass stone type thing, a little bit of glue, bit of blue glass. I'm sure I remember that happening there. I may have imagined it, you never know, but I'm sure I remember it happening. But certainly, I've seen Apport's objects appear on ghost investigations. I actually had a stone that came flying across the room that hit me and hit the wall and then bounced off my foot, and was absolutely red hot when I picked it up, and it come through a group of people, and there was nobody else in the building with us other than the group, and it wasn't one of them that thrown it. So essentially I caught a stone just thrown. But certainly I remember, because of the interest of the Black Alchemist book and Tucker Questing being involved with EarthQuest, as well as going out on a few skits with Andy, we did a couple of crop circles. We also did our own bit of investigating as well. And you mentioned about markings being left on cars. I'd forgotten all about that, because on one occasion we were kind of following up. So it used to be me who got a lot of the dream imagery and some psychic imagery. And I forget the full story of how we ended up there, but we ended up at the top of Box Hill in South London. And it was actually a very misty night, and you couldn't see a hell of a lot. But I remember looking out, and it was like a wavy pattern in the sky in the distance. It was like over some area, and at the top of Box Hill there's a semicircle that's got different things pointed out in different directions, and this thing was pointing at Chanterbury Ring, and I thought, well, we need to investigate that. And we did a few nights later. Myself, a guy called Ian James, who always came with us because he was over 6 foot and he was built like a brick house. He was kind of our security, if you like. He was excellent for that. Jason, who used to be the driver, who was mad as a hatter, and the guy called Jim I mentioned before, and myself, and there was somebody else who came with us. I forget who it was. Oh, a guy called Frank. Do lally, but he was nice enough. But we so following on from this wobbly stuff we'd seen on top of it, because at the same time Jason saw a blue figure standing to one side of this clearing that we were in. Now apparently this is the ghost of the guy that owned Box Hill, who's buried up there, vertically standing up, coffin buried straight up, and he's been a blue ghost has been seen. Now whether Jason imagined he saw it because he read about the story or what, I don't know, but Jason was sure this figure had been there. So we thought we should follow this up, and we went to Chanterbury Ring. Now Chanterbury Ring is a ring of trees on top of an Iron Age fort, on top of a very large hill, Chanterbury Hill, which we've both been to many times. But remember, on this particular occasion we drove down, and everything seemed quite normal. You park in a little car park at the base of the hill. There's like a road that leads to it, and that just doesn't go anywhere else. It's just a car park. And we parked up there, started to make our way up the hill, and we'd been going a little while, and we noticed there was headlights coming along the road to the car park. And we know that the car park as it goes nowhere else other than to the car park for the hill, the road. And this car pulled up and must have stayed there for a good 10 minutes or so. And then eventually it drove off. And I thought, oh God, you know, maybe they were going to come over as well, and they've seen our car there and decided to go off because they know someone else is already here. You know, we got up to the top, and I remember we were looking around and found this very large old stump of a tree that had been burnt out inside. And there were symbols, 4 symbols carved on the inside of the trunk. Now, I know runes very well. It looked like bind runes. Unfortunately, I didn't have a camera with me and didn't draw them or anything like that, which is a real shame. But they look like bind runes, which is a combination of runes put together, as you know. And made a note of that. I thought, this is interesting. It's a bit odd. It was relatively recently burnt because you could still flake off the black char. Anyway, we go back down. Now, it had been a bit of a rough night, and the windscreen had a bit of mud and dirt on it. And behold, on the windscreen were the same 4 symbols carved on. They'd been drawn on with a finger on the windscreen of the car. So pretty clear that whoever had driven into the car park was the ones who made that burn marks up there. Sense. Which was right, and that was quite interesting. That's one of my more interesting occasions with it. What would you say was your most dramatic event, if you like? Not sure you'll find it, but things being changed on average.
That's quite a hard one. It's going to take me perhaps a moment to think of that. I mean, because if I'd have gone on it, it would have been my first quest, which Andy did down in Dartmoor, which I was invited to go on, but sadly didn't make it. Oh. But that would have probably been a candidate, knowing actually what happened there and the fact that, you know, there was various people sort of chasing them and they had to camp out and finding artefacts and all the rest of it. But it's going to be difficult to actually say the most dramatic one. I mean, to me, the whole saga of the box, which I've already talked about, is the one which sticks in my head because it's just the one that completely my head up the most.
You do a physical object
because it was a physical object. Yeah. Well, not just that. I mean, I'd actually been led to find, you know, sort of physical artefacts before that, you know, with Andrew and certain other people that I'd quested with. A guy called Sean York, who now lives down in Dorset. He was with me when we went down to the Repstone Stone Circle, and I found my first, you know, artefact there, which, you know, had come through a dream, and, you know, we went and found that. But I think the box, because it was something which purely we just thought we'd made up, and it kind of shows that, you know, maybe, you know, if you make something up, does it somehow create a physical reality if you believe in it enough?
Yes, yeah.
And therefore, you know, I think it does, and something like that is a bit of a, you know, sort of a difficult to get your head round, because it really makes you start questioning the whole nature of reality and how you perceive it.
Absolutely, yeah, certainly. Just to recap briefly, because someone's been asking in the old chat room what's going on. Stuart? You Stuart? No, Stuart. Sorry, Steve and Stacey. Stacey? I'm having a nightmare night. Sorry, I'll start again.
You've been drinking, haven't you?
I think I might have done, yes. Steve and Sue are on their wedding anniversary holiday up in Scotland. So you've got me on my own, broadcasting from my house, using the live stream system. We're doing a little show, myself and my friend Richard here. Now, we're currently talking about psychic questing, which is basically the trail of finding objects and information via psychic means across the countryside, across the landscape, quite literally. And we're just regaling a few tales of our own experiences with both, and Richard particularly, but myself as well. I know a guy called Andrew Collins, who's probably sort of the figurehead, shall we say, of psychic modern psychic questing, certainly, although he's moved on to other things, although he's kind of gone full circle, hasn't he? Come back to the questing stuff.
Yeah, he has a little bit. I mean, I think Andrew tried to leave psychic questing behind for a while because he was starting to write more straight books, shall we say, on, you know, sort of various sites around the world, like the Göbekli Tepe one that you mentioned, Andy, you know, a little while ago, and he's trying to be sort of taken more serious as kind of an academic, if you like. But sadly, because Andrew is not an academic, he will never be accepted by the, you know, academic establishment. And I think now he's realised the fact that the psychic questing books were popular, and hence fact that he's now re-released The Black Alchemist, and he's also currently working on re-releasing another version of The Seventh Sword as well.
So we'll come back to Seventh Sword definitely in a little while. I have a little tale of adventure that was quite funny, really, with, again, to do with the same kind of quest we were involved with, one with the Chancery Ring, although we never found anything substantial. The feeling that we had was that we did interrupt something, that something was going on. Someone was trying to cause some kind of realignment of energies, or however you want to put it, but we interfered, and I think we interfered for the right reason. I think the effect we had was to stop whatever they were doing, which probably wasn't for the right reasons. Judging by what happened with our experience at the country park in Kent, I think it probably was the case.
Yeah, I mean, and that probably brings up quite another contentious point about right and wrong reasons, because Andrew Collins obviously has had sort of various dealings with people over the years that do not agree with him going to various sites and digging at artefacts, saying that if they put them there for part of a magical ritual, they shouldn't be removed. And sadly, this is one reason why he never really got on that well in life with the late occultist Andrew Chumley, who's obviously made quite a name for himself with various books like the Azawisha and the Grimoire of the Golden Toad, and sort of revitalising, sort of traditional Essex witchcraft as he saw it.
It's very big
that he would go out and sort of plant artefacts, and would say, I don't want people like Andrew Collins, picking up psychically that they're there, or and coming and removing them, and that you shouldn't be doing this. So although psychic questing does involve a lot of sort of solving historical enigmas and pulling artefacts out of the ground, there are a lot of people that don't agree with it for those reasons.
I've just suddenly realised something quite interesting. I know one of the sites that was both in the Black Alchemist, and I know Andrew Chumley made use of, was the Running Well in Runwell in Essex. And I went there some years ago when certainly Andrew Chumley was still alive. Andrew Chumley died in
2000 and was it? God, no.
I can't remember now. It was a few years ago. He died of an asthma attack.
It was, sadly, yes.
And I've retrieved an artefact, an interesting object from the well. And I do wonder if it was one of them that Chumley might have left there.
It's possible. I mean,
I'll dig it out later.
the running well, I mean, has been a votive well, i.e. one that has had offerings made at it since Roman times. And I mean, there have been Roman offerings actually pulled out the running well, which Andy has got some of.
Yes.
Because
Borrowed,
we used to go
acquired.
down there, sort of, there was a Boxing Day pilgrimage a few years back, which went on for a number of years, to actually go to the running well once a year and try and clean it up. But sadly, that was when it was actually owned by farmers that were sympathetic to that.
Yes, that's
and
somewhat
sadly
changed.
nowadays they don't want you to go anywhere near it.
Well, the last time I went there with some friends, now bear in mind it's on a public footpath, so it should be accessible at any time, regardless of being private land. This chap had deliberately built two small demountable buildings across the footpath, so you had to walk around these buildings, hence onto his land, and of course he got rather grumpy about that. We managed to get to the well, and we were on our way back when he and another man appeared, and it was dark. I mean, it's dark, but it looked forward like a shotgun, certainly a large stick, and said, "What the bleeding are you doing on my land?" To which he said, "We're visiting the well, which is perfectly fine." Anyway, when we got back to our cars, there were police were there. The farmer had phoned up the police, said that several people dressed in black cloaks, I'm not making it up, had gone down to the well, and to which he laughed at us, said, "Obviously you're not." And I said, "This is on public land, this is public footpath." And they said, "Well, he's reported you on his land." And so, well, we had no choice because he'd blocked the path through the buildings, and we reported to the Rounders Association, but nothing ever came of it. But that was years ago.
Yeah, no, I think the current owners as well are just not
Probably
keen
the
on
same
people going down there. And I mean, you're not the only one who's reported being chased off by guys with shotguns, to be perfectly
Yeah,
honest.
it's ridiculous.
Sadly.
We just came out of our chat room a moment. Dave Lloyd, one of our guests, a regular chat room guest on the show, was asking about, do you think it's linked to remote viewing? It's a similar kind of concept, really, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I mean, remote viewing is obviously something that's really sort of become, into the news, particularly with governments like the CIA and things like this using it, and having sort of people like Uri Geller in helping the FBI and the CIA to, sort of do remote viewing
A previous guest on our
and
show
I
as
mean,
well.
I would say that probably psychic questing, contains elements of remote viewing in the fact that if somebody picks up a dream about a site or anything, we will sit there and try and tune into it and literally go there in mind, which that is basically what remote viewing is. So
Absolutely.
yeah, so certainly I would agree with that, Dave.
Well, going to one of my experiences, just saying about unusual and potentially unpleasant encounters we had, as again, it's all part of the same kind of adventure, or whatever you want to call it, that was going on after Chanterbury Ring. We were then found ourselves, I must admit, I should have made a much more detailed notes of why, but we ended up at a country park in the middle of the night in Kent. It was just myself and Jason went down there. It was definitely, we felt, was linked somehow to the people who'd drawn on the car. We parked into this car park. Now, there are two car parks at this country park. Middle of the night, it was dark, obviously. We parked in one, and we knew there were cars in the other ones. We knew the people definitely were there. And we walked through the trees, and we came to a small clearing, and you could see there was a fire burning on the other side of the clearing. There were definitely people near the fire. Now, it could be kids being about, to be sure, but something was going on. And the next thing we heard was a loud bang around where Jason's car was parked. Now, Jason had, it was a Vauxhall, not Vauxhall, Volvo 440. So quite a sporty little car. He only had, he had the Vauxhall. Yeah, the 440 at the Chaser. He had the Vauxhall and the Vauxhall Astra. It was quite a new one, so he obviously didn't want to get it damaged. So his first reaction was, "What the hell's happening to my car?" So we raced back to the car. Now, bearing in mind it was centrally locked, so the passenger door was open and his window was wound down. We thought, bloody hell, yeah, this is how they get past the alarm system. Anyway, as we got into the car, we heard another car start up quite quickly in the next car park over. And the car pulled out, and Jason, being Jason, a bit of a hothead, so he was going to chase after him, thinking that one was broken into his car. Anyway, we pulled out onto the main road, and it was a Vauxhall 440, silver one. And it was going off ahead of us, and we were trying to keep up with it, but clearly this person, whoever they were, knew the roads, because they were going quite fast, and you went slow to take the bends, well, we didn't really. And we were chasing them. Now, Jason, being a bit of a nutter, he was sometimes, wanted to basically find out what we were doing to his car. So they went off into a village, I remember that, and they kind of got ahead of us, and we thought we'd lost them. And as we were driving slowly through the village, we saw the opposite end of the village was a big pub with a car park. And lo and behold, parked in the car park, there was the Volvo. Jason stopped the car, very dramatic screech of the brakes, being Jason being over the top. Anyway, the car doors opened and three blokes got out, clearly holding something large, like a baseball bat. And they could see us, and we could see them, and we got back into our car, and they got into their car, and then they proceeded to chase us around the countryside for the next half an hour or so, which was rather crazy. We ended up eventually losing them down in Brighton, a long way, with these guys behind us. We were like crapping us, I was laughing at the same time. They were still behind us, they were following us, there's no two ways about it, but we did lose them eventually in Brighton. And drove off, and we kind of just drove around the back streets. We lost them, so we head off home. Then we thought we'd go over to Clapham Wood, which you mentioned earlier on. Lo and behold, parked in the Clapham road leading up to the car, the Wood was the same car, the 440. So there was obviously some kind of connection somewhere going on with something. That was kind of the end of that adventure. I don't know, nothing else happened after that, but that was quite dramatic. I'll never forget that night. First us doing the chase and then being chased. It was ridiculous. But yeah, so it's a stranger world, but certainly I know of other people who've been involved in questing stuff and they've found bits and pieces, but often they don't tend to go anywhere. They don't tend to become like complete stories. They're just
although that said, I mean, Andrew Collins will tell you this. I mean that probably 9 out of 10 quests do not go anywhere. It's just a simple fact. Because the problem is when you have a dream about somewhere, yes, it can check out, but you still don't really know whether you're actually dreaming about something which has actually happened, dreaming about something which your subconscious would like to happen, or what it actually is. And it's only when several sort of bits and pieces start slotting together and some kind of synchronicity forms that a quest will actually start going somewhere. Because as I say, 9 out of 10 quests, just do not go anywhere. They just fizzle out at the end of the day. But you have to follow them up to a degree, because otherwise you'd never get on the quests which actually do go somewhere.
Absolutely,
so,
certainly.
And also timing is a great factor. I mean, I think a lot of the results Andrew got with Graham Phillips in the early days were because if Graham picked up something about a site, they would literally tear off there at sort of 10 or 11 o'clock that night and get back 4 o'clock the following morning or whatever, even if it was the other end of the country. And sometimes you have to be spontaneous, and I think one of Andrew's great maxims of if you're psychic quest you need to go with the flow, really illustrates that.
Absolutely, and unfortunately most of us not in a position to suddenly tear up
sadly it's not that easy to do these days when we've obviously got sort of work to do the next day or whatever. So.
One of the reasons why the guys now I'm a psychotherapist, I don't start work before 12 o'clock any day, never. So I can start 2 hours in the morning, I could go off till 4 in the morning and still get enough sleep to work the next day. But certainly, of course, yourself being a book dealer, you've set your own hours really in terms.
Yes, I mean, I'm similar to you. Obviously, I'm a night owl. And I like to sort of work into the night and sort of lay in a bit. So yeah, again, for questing purposes, that's quite handy.
Well, we'll come back onto the book thing in a little while, because of course the other thing that you guys might remember quite regularly, we now advertise Man with the Magic second-hand books on the show and in the magazine. Well, this is Mr. Richard Ward, the owner of the business, so we'll talk second-hand books in a little while. But coming back to The Seventh Sword, which is the second big book, shall we say, and is written on psychic questing. Can you tell us a bit more about that? I mean, I know it's quite a story to tell in a few minutes.
Yeah, oh my God, yeah. I mean, just considering the actual book when it came out, I think it's the best part of 500 pages, and the actual original manuscript was almost double the length of that for the amount of material that sort of got taken out. But the short version of it is, as I already mentioned a little bit earlier on, that they were led, sort of by Graham to find this sword in a bridge at a place called the Knight's Pool, and then they ended up getting led on to find this talismanic green stone in a box, which I should say that Graham was the only person present when that was found, in the middle of the night at a place called the Swan's Neck. And there's a whole background story going into sort of, which covers the Rosicrucians, the whole sort of Renaissance, Hermetic Enlightenment and everything else, which kind of established a sort of historical backstory to that, and the fact that supposedly that there were seven swords altogether. Eventually all of these 7 swords did get found, and then there are a number of rituals each year which were psychically picked up, which had to be done to sort of re-put the forces of these swords back in the land, which were done for a period of, I think, from forget the first one, it's on 1993 or 94, I think, up until 1999-2000, when the last ritual was done. And all these were carried out at a place called White-leafed Oak, which was at one time the geographical centre of England, and it's a very, very magical place.
Not somewhere I've been to, actually. I'd like to visit one day. I remember one particular that was quite fun. We won't go into the whole story of the Blackout of the Seventh Sword book, because it is quite involved, but it's certainly well worth reading, and he's got a very engaging writing style that you really feel you're part of the adventure, which is one of the things that's really good about the way he writes. And as I say, as far as we know, it's all true, definitely. But the funny thing with the Seventh Sword was that the final sword, for purposes of the book, wasn't found, but it actually had been found, and was not exactly the most dramatically exciting of places, was it, in the end?
No, very, very... I mean, it wasn't dramatic, but there were also some odd kind of things happening around that, in the fact that it actually turned up an antique dealer's at the end of Andy's Road, where he was living at the time.
Yeah, bear in mind the others have been found all over the country.
And it actually come through a guy, an arms and militaria dealer called Jim Pooley, who had a place at Battlesbridge Antique Centre for quite a few years. But the bizarre thing about that was the guy's name to me, Jim Pooley, because Andy had a lot of, shall we say, debacle, for want of a better word, with somebody who a lot of you will probably be familiar with if I mention the name Robert Rankin, who's done a lot of books, sort of fantasy books and this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And also wrote about the Brentford Griffin, which is a supernatural creature which Andrew Collins also wrote a book about. And long before the Seventh Sword came about and that whole story came about, then there was a character, I think, in one of Robert Rankin's books called Jim Pooley. And in the same series of books, he did also actually immortalise Andrew Collins himself. But I won't actually say what he said about him on a family show, because it's a little bit
it was disparaging, I think.
Yes,
the word I'm looking for here.
Good way of putting it out there.
Absolutely. So it's one of those things that you kind of fall into the sort of psychic questing stuff, because I was involved, and so I knew Richard originally through the EarthQuest group Andy ran, and then he closed it down because I know he wrote The Second Coming, which was kind of advertised as a sequel to The Black Alchemist, but it wasn't really, was it?
No, and I mean, and Andrew now acknowledges that, and I mean, although there is a very, very small amount of stuff from The Second Coming has now gone into the relaunched Black Alchemist, the material really he now does view as separate. I mean, most of it came through, a separate psychic, young lady called Deborah Benson, who's, I've known for a number of years, and was Andy's partner for a number of years also. Extremely talented psychic, very intelligent person. But it was just a little bit different to the Black Alchemist style of things. And although it seemed like that was being followed up on, and it was to a degree in the style of the questing and the artefacts that were found, it's debatable whether we're talking about two different sets of people doing different things, which I think we probably are. I think they were related in some way in what they were doing, but I don't think they were related as people.
I must admit, I should dig the book out. I've got it sitting over there, but having a look at the runes that were inscribed on the fork. Because one of the artifacts they found, if I remember right, it was a fork that was.
It was, yeah, the Trident Fork, as it was known, which was found in the ruins of Whitby Abbey.
Whitby Abbey, that's it. I must have a look at that actually, because I keep forgetting I did some research more recently on Book on Runes, which I've been writing, and I need to cross-reference some information on those and check them again. But what sort of briefly was the events in the Second Coming? Can you just give us an idea of that? Can you remember?
I've got to be
you weren't
honest.
really involved.
I wasn't really involved. I wasn't really involved with the Second Coming events, to be perfectly honest. I know there was, the Dartmoor escapade that I mentioned, sort of earlier, was kind of part of it, where they went down to this stone circle on Dartmoor and ended up finding these boxes with these stones in, which had symbols painted on them, designed to go into the ground at specific times. And that the Trident Fork found at Whitby was some kind of follow-up to that, but that was all surrounding a group which Debbie, sort of coined the people of Hex.
Mm-hmm. That was it, yes.
And the people of Hex may have been working, sort of with the Black Alchemist or along the same lines, but there's certainly no evidence of that. It's all very circumstantial, to be perfectly honest. And I think Debbie will agree with that as well. Obviously there was reality to what was going on. The artefacts were found and there was definitely something weird happening, but I don't think it was really linked to the Black Alchemist himself and that original kind of saga of events.
So it was kind of just almost using the name to kind of push the. Well, it was not supposed the name was the cover of the
really
book.
Using
of course.
the name. I mean,
the cover of the book though was kind of rehashed.
I think the thing was it again fell under the banner of what sort of Andrew would term black questing, which is sort of following up information which leads you to sort of solve enigmas and get artifacts from the ground which have been placed there for sort of nefarious and sort of purposes which disturb the energies of a site rather than are in harmony with it, and therefore also can have detrimental effects on the psychics concerned. And when I've sort of comparatively recently, when I went back down to Sussex with Andy in the wake of relaunching the Black Alchemist, I mean there's certainly still quite a dark aura down there in certain of the places, and it did make me feel unwell. I mean, whether that's purely psychosomatic or whether there's something more to it, nobody can really know. But as I've already said, working with Andy has made me sort of challenge my perception of reality and the fact that we can actually create our own reality. So therefore, it's still valid.
So the other one that I know reasonably well that you were definitely directly involved in was the 21st Century Grail.
Yes.
That was another questing kind of book, wasn't it? The questing was in it, but it was more.
It was. And although there were some interesting artifacts that came out, also one thing which I would like to talk about is when you do psychic questing sometimes, I'm convinced that if there's a quest out there to be got onto and you can find out about it, the universe, in inverted commas, for want of a better way of putting it, will give you a garden in which to play. And the thing is, my garden in which to play at the time was looking very much into some of the thelemic stuff to do with Aleister Crowley, and in particular, surrounding a deity which he talked about and sort of saw his Scarlet Women as an incarnation of, called Babylon. And the network of geometry that I picked up psychically was all kind of based around that. And I would definitely say that whereas the actual quest for the artifacts and the quest for a cup supposedly owned by Aleister Crowley was certainly real to us at the time, it was certainly the universe giving me a garden in which to play, in which I could perpetuate these energies which were sort of all surrounding my interest in sort of Thelema and Babylon at the time.
Excellent. I know I remember reading some of it was like an egg cup was found or something along those lines. It was also mistaken for being the actual Grail rather than something.
No. I think what you're coming on to here is the fact that I picked up that what we would have as a representation of the Grail would be this cup which Crowley owns supposedly. But what happened was that I picked up the fact that Andy's then wife Sue would actually be the one who would actually find it. Right, okay. And lo and behold, she was actually given to be custodian of a small cup which, as you said, Andy, looked, for instance, intents and purposes, like an egg cup. which was actually a thing called the Hawkstone Grail, which Graham Phillips had actually found in Hawkstone Park. As part of his own questing, sort of activities to do with sort of the Grail and King Arthur and things like that. But felt for some reason that he should give it to Sue without any knowledge of our current activities. So that kind of became our Grail representation as part of that quest that we got.
Excellent.
But we didn't actually find, the cup that Crowley was supposed to have. I think, yes, we can create our own reality, but I think that's probably stretching it just a little bit too far.
I tell you what, we actually solve one little question that came up last week with one of our regulars, Beth, who's not actually, unfortunately, in tonight, as far as I can see. She might be listening in, because we do actually have 9 people listening in, even though there's only 3 in the chat room with us, but it's good that the people are contributing. As to Crowley or Crowley?
You say Crowley, I say Crowley. I mean,
that's what I think. Yeah. I've always said Crowley, even though it's spelled as
I don't think there's any, sort of hard and fast pronunciation. Tomato. They're both correct. I don't think there's any real.
Do you think he would have corrected you one or the other if you'd said it to him? Do you think he gave a damn?
I don't know. It would probably depend on what time of his life it was and how off his face on drugs he was at the time.
Sounds about right.
Perfectly honest.
Well, okay, we're going to take a little bit of a break now. I'm going to attempt to give you the events coming up in June, reading off the screen here, and I'll give you some little stories I have come across. I think keeping the little news clippings more to do with occult-related material rather than supernatural. As for tonight, and one night only, we are keeping the occult friendly. And if you want to have a little break and have a little smoke, if you want to.
I should have a cigarette break, I think.
Okay, well, let's hand it back to me for a little while, guys. Again, if there's any questions anyone's got about anything at all to do with questing or the occult, or what we're going to talk about a little while is going to be second-hand book dealing, as well as talking about black magic and white magic and witchcraft and all those kind of gubbins. So if you have any questions about anything, be sure to send them in. I'm just going to find the events thing that Sue sent to me to let you know what's on in June. Now this is on the Paranormal Events for You listing. They are all listed on paranormalevents4you.com, and you can have a look at that to see what's going on. Now the events I've got listed here, it doesn't tell me who's running these events, but I will read them to you. They may all be just our own, as in Shadow Seekers, but I think there's others involved. On the 13th of June, the New Jerusalem Church in Wigan have an event on, paranormal event of some kind or other. Let me just see if I can get onto the actual screen, because it might help me out a bit more if I can view that. Also on the 20th of June, and the 20th of June as well, the Scottish UFO and Paranormal Conference takes place in Scotland. Again, I don't have the full details of where these things are, but I know that it's in Scotland. And on the 26th to the 28th of June, the Jamaica Inn investigation, which I know is involving Sue's group, Sue and Steve's group, Shadow Seekers. They're going there for a weekend, I believe, so it should be interesting. And that's all I can tell you at the moment. Also, at this point, we usually have the adverts, including the advert for Pigs, for their equipment show. But again, I don't have the access to those clips, so I'm just going to say go and visit the Pigs website for equipment which you can buy. And if I can find thepigs.com, I shall give you the full SP of their website address, which is not appearing. It just now appeared. Except it's called the Pig Hotel. Okay, there we go. No, it's still coming out with the same thing. Never mind. So yeah, just to recap, at the moment it is just myself tonight because Steve and Sue are enjoying their wedding anniversary up in Scotland. So yeah, no problems. We're basically, I'm wigging it now on my own at the moment, just talking about various subjects. The paranormal events for you stuff, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of again. I must call it up, but also we obviously advertise very regularly the Pigs website for equipment which you can buy. You go to equipment which they have imported into the country directly, so you're not buying from sort of the Far East or America and waiting for everything to turn up. They only charge the basic postage price because they've already brought the stuff into the country for us, which is very helpful. You can find out information about the Pigs website on www.the-pigs.co.uk/the Ghost Store. Those of you who don't know, which I'm sure everyone does, the Pigs call themselves that because they're actually run by an ex-police officer, and I think more than one member of the ghost team themselves is actually a former or currently serving police officer. So it's good to know that our police friends are interested in the ghosts just as we are. So that's quite good. And the other thing I want to mention is I'm doing some little film reviews over the next sort of every show. I've always been a bit of a fan of the old paranormal films, mainly sort of ghosts, supernatural ones. I'm not a big fan myself of what you might call the gore porn, which is basically people being sort of chopped to bits and hurt nastily, and things like the Saw movies will be the best known of that. I like films that have a certain supernatural angle to them. Just go look at the side of my head if you're actually viewing the thing, because previously told me to get the Paranormal Events for You thing back up on the screen. So in a little while I'm going to give you a review of a couple of the films I've watched over the last few weeks. There are some good ones and some not so good ones out there. In fact, if I can just find the Paranormal Events for You list, I can tell you what's going on. I should also mention that we are big fans of the Phenomena magazine, of course. Steve Mercer and co run that one. And there's the new one, whose name I've completely forgotten. Oh yes, our own magazine, of course, the KTPF magazine, which I'm currently working at the moment on the next edition, which should be out fairly soon. Hopefully, obviously, before the end of this month. And that we'll be able to tell you all about that next week's show, as it'll be out by then, hopefully. But I've got some interesting stuff coming up. I've got extracts from the book that John Blackburn mentioned back at the beginning of the month when he was talking about the Irishman experiments of the painting. The book's called Lifting the Veil, and he's kind of given me quite a sizable chunk of from the yet to be published book. I believe it's coming out towards the end of the month, end of the year, I should say. And it certainly makes fascinating reading, as those who know a little bit about it will know that the painting appears to have something connected to it, which John has called David. Now, whether he's referring to the painting, the creature in the painting, or one for a better word, the painter himself, or something extra that's become attached to the painting, I don't know. But it's all very intriguing, because the thing seems to be able to produce information that is very accurate. And part of the article I've got from John goes into some detail about the information that the painting actually gave during a séance regarding a member of the public who was actually at the séance, and it's very linked close to his great-grandfather, and it's fascinating reading. Also have an extract from Scotty Roberts from last week, his book on the Nephilim, which we ended up talking about quite a bit. He's kind of given me a very long extract from the book, which I'll hopefully put up in the entirety. Although it may have to cut something off, because it is actually very long, and it's very good when you send all that information. We also have the second and final part of my demonology talk, which I gave obviously on the show a few months ago now, over a month ago. I didn't have much time to go into the psychological side of supposed demon possession, and I do go into a lot more detail in the article. Now, some of it I think may be a bit controversial. I'm sorry if I offend anybody with it, but it is my strongly held views, and it is my views, not necessarily Sue's or Steve's, but they're my views about demonology. But yeah, certainly you can read that, and hopefully we'll have either this month or next month's edition. We'll have stuff from my friend Steve, which is here talking all about psychic questing. But just to give you a quick rundown of the events still going on at the moment. Tony Stockwell is on tour at the moment. His tour runs from the 26th of July last year right up until the 15th of May this year. So you may well go on to that. Derek Cora's Psychic Ether Tour is still going on. It's going on until, actually almost finished, end of the month he finishes, 29th of April. And then he'll be wrapping up. And let me have a look. So what else can I mention about? A few other events going on that look very interesting. And one place I've never been to, would love to go to, is the Draco Tunnels on the 9th of May. There's an event there. These are all on the Paranormal Events for You website, so you can have a look on those to get an idea of what's going on. Another location I've been to, which I found quite interesting, not exceptionally interesting, but it was interesting nonetheless. On the 30th of May at the Redoubt Fortress, the event going on there, which doesn't actually say who's running it, which is rather annoying, but the 31st, it's all on the Events for You. Have a look at that site. And the Scottish Paranormal and UFO Conference, which is on the 20th of June, is in somewhere in Scotland. No surprise there. You can tell I'm winging this, can't you? You really can tell I'm winging it. It's in Edinburgh. Anyway, get in contact with either Malcolm Robertson or Alison Dunlop. Alison is a regular on our show, a regular listener, or Ron Halliday for more information there. Again, it's all on the Paranormal Events for You, so go on and have a look there. So I'm going to come on to my little stories a bit later on, my film reviews and the couple of stories I've found on Paranormal News. I'll do it a little while because my friend Richard has returned to us and come back over. Just waffling on for about 10 minutes there, talking about the events coming up and the next part of our magazine, which you will be in either this next one or the one after. The other thing, of course, that we're going to talk about is collecting occult books. Now, as guests...
so close to my heart, obviously.
Absolutely, but our listeners may know, Richard is the guy that gets advertised quite regularly now in the magazine and on the show. And have been, what, at least 10 years now, must be?
Yes, well, full-time since 2005, but I've been collecting since I was a teenager. And I first started selling a few catalogues with Andrew Collins, funnily enough. We did a few lists, sort of back in the early 90s, which was quite successful.
Excellent.
But now, since 2005, I've been doing it as a full-time career.
So what made you turn it into a full-time job?
Just something that I just love, and just thought, I can do this. I call it a midlife crisis if you like. The fact that, I don't know what it was. I just decided that I didn't really want to work in the building trade anymore, and decided that I really want to, sort of do full time, sort of working on second-hand books.
So, is it kind of profitable? I mean, second-hand books.
I wouldn't say that. I made far more money when I was working for other people in the building trade. To be honest, selling second-hand books, I think it's more of a vocation than it is, sort of a job to make loads of money out of.
Yeah, that's fair
Unless you're at the upper ends when you're sort of dealing in, sort of first edition Crowleys and things like that, which turn, a few thousands of pounds, So
what would you say was the most valuable book you've ever actually sold?
Ooh, that's a good question. I can't honestly think of an answer to that offhand, to be perfectly honest.
I can think of a couple that come to mind that I've acquired from you. Of course, there was a little backstory behind the first public edition of the Key of Solomon, which I acquired from you from a period of time.
Oh yes.
Wasn't intended to have
been
sold.
It's probably not the most valuable I've ever sold, to be perfectly honest. But it's the most valuable in monetary terms. It's probably no more than sort of a few £100, to be honest.
Still, for a book, that's quite impressive. Yeah. I mean, the funny little story with the Solomon book was that basically it was swapped for a laptop because yours had died.
That's right. Yeah. So I had to keep on working. So I had to do it somehow. And,
selling for a laptop, which unfortunately then died itself. Died not long afterwards, which was a real nothing to do with me. It wasn't a curse or anything. It was just one of those things. And I ended up getting it back because I now have the Graveyard Wanderers, which is a much more fascinating book for me personally.
Yes.
It kind of brings me on to what we're going to talk about next, which really is the occult itself, our own interest in that. The Graveyard Wanderers, which is a very fascinating book. It's actually part of someone's dissertation on Swedish folk magic. Basically involving, obviously, graveyards, hence the title Graveyard Wanderers, but involving charms and spells from sort of folklore of Scandinavia, which I have personally become very fascinated by, particularly English folklore, obviously folk magic, which links into the Andrew Chumley guy who was talking about a bit earlier on, who was also a regular at EarthQuest, and I do still have this vague image in my head of the guy, of someone who fitted his description, actually standing by a big window upstairs in the ship pub where EarthQuest used to meet, and I'm sure it was Chumley because it was a slightly roundish guy, red hair, sort of tied up on top. Definitely that image blazing in my head as being...
Yeah, as I said earlier, I mean, unfortunately he didn't go to too many EarthQuests after that because, he had a bit of a falling out with Andrew over, the sort of the rights and wrongs of pulling artefacts from ancient sites.
Absolutely.
Which unfortunately they just had to agree to disagree on.
So we are talking about what is now really called traditional witchcraft, as him being one of the innovators of bringing that tradition kind of back to life almost. It's,
True, although what he took on board was, it was still from a number of different sources. It wasn't one pure tradition that Andrew actually practiced. I mean, he had a lot of other what might be termed occult interests. I mean, he was introduced to various other things. Jamaican Abia, for example, from a guy, which is sort of one of the Afrocentric religions. He also had interests in sort of voodoo and Lakumi or Santeria, as it's also known, and all of these certainly coloured his sort of the operative side of his sort of Essex witchcraft, as it might be termed.
Yeah. One of the things that one of our guests, who's actually Steve, one of the usual co-hosts, is asking us about: is there much of a market for black magic books? His question is: people talk about black magic. Is there a big difference? And there's a big market for the books that What would you say was your best seller that you've had?
Oh my word. Well, I mean,
I suppose
all right. If we start
orders,
if we start on black magic books, then for one thing, I mean, I don't like the term black magic personally.
No, I agree entirely.
You know, I don't think you can categorically divide magic into black and white. All magic is grey, and you know, a number of other occultists I know, you know, sort of share that view as well.
I think why you can look at it is it's like electricity, and you can use that to power up your TV or power up the torture chamber.
Exactly, exactly. You know, I mean, it's how you use the energies, and that's all down to your own moral mindset. You know, and there are certainly grey areas, I would say. You know, I know people that have, you know, sort of cursed for reasons which I look at and say, yeah, actually, you know, in your position, I would have probably done the same thing.
Absolutely.
So,
but certainly, what would you say was a book that has kind of had hundreds of people or dozens of people suddenly try and buy from you on your list? That's really like, bloody hell, this is like really, or something that's been like, I'm glad I've got this. This is gonna fly out.
I don't know, because sometimes it's books that you wouldn't think. You know, I get, you know, sort of, if I get certain books, you know, I mean, I might only get half a dozen orders, you know, something like that for them. But obviously, you know, there's only one copy. I can only sell it once. But I can't think of any specific. Really. Yeah, I can't think of any specifics off the top of my head, to be honest. I mean, black magic books do sell, you know, because they've got a little bit of a notoriety. But to be honest, I mean, when you start looking at the content of a lot of them, you know, they're a triumph for style over substance, to be perfectly
absolutely,
honest.
as I've discussed in my demonology article, a lot of them are derivatives of each other anyway, and there's no, it comes down to maybe 3 or 4 kind of almost original texts, if you like, that have been plagiarised and twisted and distorted, things like Jonathan Ware's book, the De Potestas Demonominum, which is my attempt at pronunciation of the Latin, something along those lines. How would you pronounce it?
Oh God!
It's not easy.
No, it's not. I'm not. I don't think I'm even going to attempt it.
Okay,
actually.
well, we'll stick with my brave attempt I mentioned in the book. But that was one of the earliest printed books that you could describe as talking of black magic in the sense of what we were saying before about demonic powers. The appendix that was added later on at the end, specifically naming these demons. But as I talk about in my article, the actual origin of a lot of this stuff is kind of a bit sort of lost in the mist of time almost.
Well, it is obviously, you know, the word demon, as we know, you know, goes back to daemon, you know, sort of in, you know, sort of ancient Latin and Greek sources, you know, which it didn't mean anything evil whatsoever. It's only come to mean that, you know, sort of later on. And I mean, probably going back to sort of witchcraft and traditional witchcraft, you've got, you know, sort of a devil figure, for want of a better term for it, in most of these traditions, but it's not a devil in the Christian sense. Absolutely. I mean, you know, really that sort of angle only really came about with Christianity. You know, sort of, it was a demonisation of the old gods.
Absolutely, I mean, as we were saying again in the article, was the fact that that's one of the ways in which Christianity spread itself. You couldn't just eliminate these other beings, other deities worshipped. So you demonise them quite literally, and them become the evil forces.
You know, and obviously, we know that a lot of churches in Britain are built on pagan sites. It was like, you know, we need to take over this, you know, this energy. We know it's there, so therefore, you know, we will Christianise it.
Absolutely, and we have things like, as again, I keep going back to my article, I know, but you look at in the Bible, there are cases and stories of Jesus helping people who've been possessed by demons, but they're never named, these demons. They never have any identity. It's undoubtedly, I think, it's examples of psychological, physical illness that he's actually
it could well be. And to be perfectly honest, I mean, most, going back to the folk magic thing, most, you know, sort of cunning men or cunning folk as they were known, practiced as traditional, you know, sort of English folk magic, would have had a knowledge of, you know, sort of what we would these days call, you know, psychology and psychotherapy.
Absolutely.
But it wasn't looked at in those terms. But it was a very, very important part of what they did. The fact that they could actually read a patient, for want of a better word, that came to them for help. Because that was the only way they could help them successfully, is if they understood a little about what was going on psychologically.
Absolutely, as I mentioned again in the article about Freud recognising that De Potestas Demonominum, I'm trying to pronounce it again, the Ware book behind the Ware's book, was probably the first to really identify the possibility of psychological illness being the cause of so-called demonic possession. And Freud says it's one of the 10 most important books ever written for that reason, because it is actually attempting to say,
well, yeah,
this could be
and
all in the
obviously
mind.
you've got others like Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. It's another one, probably,
yeah,
you know, worst statement, which I think came out in the
16
something,
17th
century.
A little bit later on, but yeah, again, it's going down that road actually of saying, well, look, at the time these people were writing, particularly about so-called demonic possession, they had no knowledge of psychological illness. I mean, something as simple as an asthma attack, where someone appears to be being choked to death, can be seen as being possessed by a demon. It's just asthma.
Yeah.
which we recognise as being easy treatable with an asthma pump now.
Well, yeah. I mean, take the example of Andrew Chumley, for example, who sadly sort of died not that many years ago for an asthma attack. At a tragically young age. It shocked me the amount of occultists, inverted commas, that came out the woodwork shortly after his death and say, I cursed Andrew Chumley and was responsible for his death. And I just thought that was a very sad person.
Absolutely. In fact, we both know someone who was terrified that he may have been the cause himself as well, saying exactly the same sort of thing. He said it privately, but little deluded, short person we used to both know quite well. Yes. No names mentioned at all.
Yes.
But one of the questions Stephen's just asked, which is a good one, and I would struggle to answer this. If you were to recommend one particular book, what would you recommend?
It depends what subject you want to
Exactly.
look on.
It's vast, isn't it?
Sort of. I don't think there is really a good general book on the occult.
Yeah.
Because it just wouldn't do the subject justice. You'd have to really sort of be a little bit more specific.
It's
about
like saying, if you want to recommend one book on science, what would you recommend?
Yeah, exactly. It is too vast, I think.
I think if you wanted to look into Western traditional, Hermetic magic, I think would probably be the way, rather than the traditional folk magic, the Hermetic high magic, I would say, you're looking at something like the Golden Dawn complete works as a starting point, although it's easier to follow.
Or if you want something purely historical, something probably like Thorndike's History of Magic and Experimental Science.
That's true,
you probably couldn't do better than that for a complete overview.
Although if you want to be more practical, it would rather bore you to death.
Yes.
I would say, people often deride Francis Barrett's The Magus. Well, I think it's an excellent book. It's all nicked from other sources, but as a collection, I think it's a brilliant book for sort of just give you a grounding, even if it was written back in 1801. And it kind of brings us a bit full circle, talking about folk magic again. One of the most important characters, if you like, or historic figures in folk magic is a chap called Cunning Murrell, who was from Leigh-on-Sea, which is
he's from Hadley actually.
Hadley next.
Yes,
literally no more than 15
well,
minutes.
actually, I think he was born somewhere else in the borough of Rochford. Actually, I don't think he wasn't actually born in Hadley, but that's where he's most well known and associated with, because he spent the biggest part of his life in Hadley when he returned from London.
Well, he was certainly local, shall we say, to Essex. South Essex is where we are now. We will leave either side of him basically. I'm in Basel. Yeah. You're in sort of West Cliff, the other side. But he's we don't know much about what's left of his material, but one thing we do know is he probably did have a copy of the Magus, because amongst the few pieces of paper that were left, because a lot of his paper was lost, wasn't it, or destroyed, was hand-drawn images that definitely from the page of the Magus, which is quite interesting. So
there's no doubt that he took, but then that was kind of common for, cunning folk of the day to sort of pull material from these published books. I mean, if you go back to things like Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft, which came out in the late 16th century, when the third edition of that came out in 1665, a lot of cunning folk and witches took that, because the appended material, 2 books of Devils and Evil Spirits, and also some extra material added to the 15th chapter of that book, form a complete grimoire of folk magic, basically.
Absolutely. I mean, please come back to what Steve's question. That was one I'd recommend, if you can get hold of a copy of the third edition of Discovery of Witchcraft.
Yeah, that's the one you really want.
Yeah.
If you're going to have a copy, that's the one you want.
Material in that. Again, it's source material. There are, and the trouble is with it is the one that gets reprinted the most often is the first edition, which is lacking a lot of material.
It is, yes.
It's the third edition, which I've got the EP publishing edition, which one was about 100 quid's worth. And this chap here has got the original, well, not original, but the 1886 Nicholson edition, which sells for 4 figures now. And I'm trying to price it on his hand, but I don't think it's ever going to happen. It's a fabulous piece of work, it really is. But it's one of those books that really deserves much better credit and should be more readily available than it actually is. And there is an Indian company who've recently reprinted a nice little hardback version. But it's so bloody small. You need a magnifying glass to read some of it.
Obviously, and you do need a magnifying glass, unfortunately. But,
just some quick questions. Sue, our co-host, is asking, what drew you into the subject in the first place? And where does your passion lie?
Well, if you're talking about what drew me to the occult, for want of a better word, in the first place, it's probably growing up. 2 things. The fact that my father used to have a lot of weird interests, but was in no way practically interested in the occult, but used to talk to me about a lot of strange occult things, and sort of gave me my first little bit of magic to do, which freaked the crap out of me. And also the ancestry on my mother's side, in the fact that my great-great-grandmother was, for want of a better word, termed the local midwife, who used to go round the farming communities in where she lived in Tiptree and Tuddick, little place in Essex, and sort of, you know, do sort of healing for people, and basically did live her life by sort of superstitions and things like that and folk magic. So that's kind of in the background of my family, you know, and both of those things, as I was sort of, you know, growing up sort of as an influential sort of, you know, teenager, I think had quite a profound effect on me, and kind of started me off on the strange path I'm on now.
For me, it's a total bleeding mystery where my interest came from, because my actual family have no interest at all. It's just me, but I distinctly remember having some very strange dreams in the early 80s that turned out to be a representation of what's called the Kabbalah. I remember this dream of spheres, and I mean, I literally saw like the Kabbalah, the Tree of Life symbol in the sky, and I came across Dion Fortune's Mystical Kabbalah book and read that and thought, bloody hell, I've been dreaming about this thing. That was particularly freaky. But I did find out later on that my dad's grandmother, he lived in South Wales, she was the wise woman, the cunning woman, like, of the village, and she used to be the one that people would turn to for help.
And I don't think that's particularly uncommon, to be honest with you. I think that if you look back in sort of family history, there's probably somebody in there in most people's families that actually practiced folk magic in some way, because it was purely, you know, sort of a way of life, particularly the healing side of it. You know, if you go back into the 19th century, you know, you didn't have the National Health Service like you have now, and the same doctors you have now, and, you know, you would have had to make do with these things. And you know, I mean, a lot of, obviously, you know, sort of what was herbalism then and what was termed occult is now, you know, sort of accepted by mainstream science.
Absolutely. So the herbal remedies and the basis of all modern medicine started off as herbs that have been worked in and experimented with and synthesised. But yeah, I mean, for me, I've kind of adopted Colin Murrell. James Murrell as my adopted grandfather, because my personal story is a little strange. I don't have a grandfather. Exactly. I mean, it's a long story as to why not. So I don't have a maternal grandfather, so Colin Murray is my maternal grandfather. I've decided that some time ago. But yes, he's asking, what's your specific area of passion?
What, in sort of occult books, or what?
The occult itself. Now, one of the things we should say is that occultists tend to be quite secretive about what they do and not necessarily talk about it. So you might not answer these questions, so just be aware. But what's your area of interest?
Well, I'll answer the question, but I'm going to be a little bit sort of perhaps veiled. I mean, certainly one of my biggest passions is indigenous Essex folk magic, for the reasons I've said, because there is, you know, some kind of family history behind it. There's a lot of other stories to do that with, which I'm not going to go into tonight, I'm afraid.
That's right.
And also I'm extremely interested in Afrocentric religions as well, and the way they've sort of come out across the world, things like hoodoo, voodoo, OBR and things like that, because they just seem a much rawer form of magic than, you know, a lot of the modern sort of magics in this country. If you take Wicca and things like that, you know, they're you know, I'm not going to diss Wicca at all, because, you know, as a religion, you know, there's a lot of people follow it, they get a lot out of it, and that's fine. But it's a very, very dumbed down and synthesised version of the kind of, you know, what I would call more traditional magics. And it is really, if I wanted to put, you know, what interests me the most under a huge banner, it would be traditional magical systems rather than something that's been modern and synthesised. And in the case of Wicca, obviously, you know, only been with us, you know, since the late 1940s at the earliest.
Yeah. Despite Gerald Gardner's the founder trying to claim it was
despite his claims that, you know, he was part of a medieval witch lineage, you know, I'm sorry, but, you know, all you Wiccans out there, I apologise for this, but that's complete bollocks.
Absolutely. It's interesting that someone's actually, there's a TV programme said a little while ago that it's the only religion that Britain's given the world, which I think is something at least.
It is, you know, although probably, you know, a little sadly, it's more embraced in America these days than it is in Britain.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of the rebellion against Christianity, isn't it, in America? Because Christianity is a much more powerful influence on the lives of Americans. Yeah, well, obviously you've got, you know, sort of parts of, you know, the deep south in America where, you know, if you talk about witchcraft or anything like that, you know, they're probably still likely to want to, you know, sort of put on a white robe and burn you. Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a little question that's been discussed previously, but I want to get your take on this as well. We've had guests, plural actually, in the past, who've said that the Vatican holds dark, sinister manuscripts of magic and the like. Now, I'm very much of the opinion that that's a load of rubbish, and that basically it's the other way around, that the Vatican may have acquired some of these manuscripts, but they already existed. They weren't sort of Vatican generated, or the Vatican have been able to hide them because they've been out there. They've thought, oh well, we'll have our copies of X, Y, Z, but I don't think there are any dark manuscripts of satanic evil that the Vatican are sitting on.
No, I mean, but then again, we don't know. I mean, you know, if ever I could do, you know, a fantasy supermarket sweep, as it were, just give me a trolley and let me loose in the Vatican Library for a couple of hours, and I'll be a happy man.
Have a bit of fun.
You know, I mean, certainly they hold an incredible amount of occult lore in their library, but as you say, Andy, you know, I don't think, you know, that it's, you know, been purely invented by them. It's just been acquired over the years. I mean, you know, I know a lot of, you know, sort of theologians and, you know, sort of people, you know, connected with the Church of England that have, you know, occult materials in their library. You know, I don't think that's anything particularly uncommon.
I know for a fact that St Paul's Cathedral I used to work at, they had a bit of a clear out a few years ago and actually did surreptitiously sell off quite a few older, more valuable tomes that included things like the Discovery of Witchcraft, and they had a copy of that, and I think books along those lines from
doesn't
sort of 17th, 18th century. But I mean, if you want the sort of the dark, diabolical magic, bloody, the books are out there. Go out and buy them. You know, the Grand Grimoire, the Black and the Red Dragon, they're all readily available.
They are, yeah. Sadly, only they sort of date from the 19th century.
Yeah,
but, I mean,
of course, they're derivative of the early material. As I said in the article, the earliest I've been able to identify as being published, now they're handwritten manuscripts, of course, but published is the Goetia. That's the earliest I've actually managed to identify as being a published manuscript that contains both spells, sigils, and names of demons. Earlier than that, there are some handwritten manuscripts are floating about, which obviously is where people like Johann Wehr got their list of names from. But the Goetia seems to be the first one that really pops up. It's now part of a collection called the Legamaton, which is the Lesser Key of Solomon, which is the counterpart to the Greater Key, which we were talking about earlier on, which I acquired from you because of a laptop.
Yes.
But I mean, they're the main texts that exist that really go into this kind of information. But again, it's very Christianized, isn't it? It's very much the Christian concept of evil and the devil living as an actual being. Whereas we both know that earlier texts, there isn't that straight division between good and bad, is there?
No, and I think that may have been, you know, sort of due to the fact that the law changed in Britain, as, you know, for want of a, you know, a case in point, you know, sort of that magic had always been against the law since Anglo-Saxon times, but then I can't remember the exact date, but I think it was at some point in either the 16th or 17th century that it became, you know, punishable by statute, and it became a much bigger crime, and therefore you started to see a lot of these texts coming out which were dealing with, you know, sort of magic, but angelic magic, and making this very clear division between things which are under God and things which are under the devil.
Yes, this is the division
which didn't exist, you know, prior to that, really.
And yet, if you point out this fact, which is absolutely a fact to a lot of people, they'll say, well, no, there's always been this kind of this side and that side, and these ancient texts in the 12th and 3rd and 4th centuries talking about, no, it's where they've been rewritten and retranslated from the originals. Let's have a look. We have a question. Yeah, there seems to be a lot of Grimms out there, but is there a true one? The answer is really no.
Well, the answer is in name that there is a book called The True Grimoire.
Grimoire in Verum, yeah.
But that's not the first. No. That's not the first Grimoire, and even that we can see its antecedents. You know,
yeah,
so I'm sure that, you know, what you say, Andy, is, you know, is correct. I mean, but then again, obviously, you can go back to sort of, you know, spells, you know, in the sort of, you know, Greco-Egyptian magical papyri.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it depends how far back you want to go, and whether you want to go back, you know, sort of prior to the, you know, the written word. I mean, you know, spellcraft has existed, you know, since Stone Age times, where man would paint, you know, images of bison on cave walls with people chasing them in order to, you know, sort of create a fruitful hunt.
Absolutely. I mean,
so, you know, magic has always been used.
You could describe something like the Egyptian Book of the Dead as the magical papyri of Anu has actually got magical spells in it. Yeah. That has been a grimoire. I mean, the grimoire is just a term of a book of spells, essentially. I think it's a bastardisation of the word grammar in French, I think, something along those lines. I remember reading somewhere in my research, but just a term of grimoire has become very much... It rolls off the tongue, isn't it? Grimoire.
It does.
Sounds impressive. Yes. I mean, they say the proper early ones that all really date from the 1600s that are kind of genuine, if you like. And I said the veritable Key of Solomon is probably the most interesting. There was one that popped up fairly recently that had been around for a long time that wasn't recognised as being as important as it actually is, because it was thought to be just a book on water magic. That's the Hygromentia, which I never quite pronounced properly. But the research that was done on it actually identified that it was probably the source material for a lot of the other grimoires. And certainly the two Solomon books, the greater key, I should say, has definitely been derived from the Hydromentia. And the interesting thing was, the book itself was discovered in a monastery in Greece. And what was happening was that the monks were using old leather-bound books as cushions to pray on, to kneel on. And this guy came visiting and basically found this one and had a look at it, and suddenly realised there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. But this is actually quite a seriously important individual book. Again, it only goes back to 1500s. It's not older than that, but it certainly looks like it predates certainly the Greater Key of Solomon. I mean, the Lesser Key, the Goetia, is the earliest part of the Lesser Key. So that was quite an interesting one. It's been recently reprinted as well.
It's Golden Horde,
the Golden Horde series of books. So I suppose if you want to get kind of intellectual and a really good understanding of the history of these books, as well as the books themselves, the series of books, the Hermetic Sourcework, the Sourcework, they're called. No, the Golden Horde series.
It's Hermetic Sourcework series.
Yeah, Hermetic Sourcework series. Yeah. It's a series of books that have been published by Stephen Skinner and early ones with David Rankin. There's 8 in the series at the moment. And I'll put the links up to this actually at some point because they are well worth getting hold of. I mean, they're not cheap, they're 20, 30 quid each, and they're nice hardback books. But they will give you a very good overview. Those two, particularly Stephen Skinner, is a fantastic researcher in this area, isn't he?
Yes.
Brilliant researcher. He's not written specifically a book on grimoires, but all the books he's done, which are reprints of grimoires, have included lengthy examinations and introductions to the books with lots of detailed information. So Stephen Skinner's books are well worth getting hold of if you really want to get into the field.
I probably would add as well that Owen Davis's recent book on grimoires is a great source for the history of these books for anybody who wants to, a historical overview of the subject.
Absolutely. So Skinner's book will give you both a history and the actual magic itself in his books, but also the Owen Davis book, and I will put a link up for both of those in the chat room in a second, once I have a chance. Interesting, I'm actually Facebook friends, as people often are with various people. And I was talking to Stephen Skinner recently because the Sourcework series itself at the moment appears to be on a bit of a hold, and he just said that, I asked why that is, and he just said there's just so much other stuff going on at the moment, because his most recent book, and there's a link to Stephen Skinner's site, is fantastic. It's the Greco-Egyptian book of magic, which is based on the, you said the name just now? No, I can't remember.
Greco-Magical Papyri.
Greco-Magical Papyri in translation.
By Betts.
Which is one of the, again, early source work of Greek magic. Now, it's still, his book is modern, the Greek manuscripts are ancient, they're not the same kind of thing as the Goetia, or they're not really grimoire material as such, but they are very important as early examples of magic, as we were talking about previously, that goes back a long way. And Stephen has done a fantastic book of examining the papyri, because the William Beck's book is not easy to follow, is it? It's kind of a little bit all over the place.
Well, I don't know. I found it all right.
Okay, it's easy to follow, so I don't know why Stephen's going to bother writing his book. No, Stephen's is more kind of systematic approach of how to get through this kind of stuff, which I
mean, the Betts, sort of Greco-Magical Papyri book is, it's purely just a compilation of text with notes. It's a very scholarly book rather than a practical book. It's probably
well, Skinner's book's turned into a much more practical manual of magic, so that's particularly impressive. He's also worked on another book, which is a strong passion of both Richard and I, a guy called Dr. John Dee, who I know has been mentioned on the show previously. In fact, I was going to ask John Ward, a co-guest from last week, some questions about Dee, because he's written on Dee. Unfortunately, John couldn't make it, as you know, because his house was in a sandstorm in Egypt, so he didn't actually make it on the show. But John Dee's manuscripts, diaries, were published in 1649 by a chap called Merrick Casaubon, and now he just basically reprinted the diaries, but obviously typeset, but they're so full of errors. They're hard to read in places. It's 1650s printing, so it's awful to try and really follow it systematically. But Stephen Skinner has actually gone through the whole book, which is over 500 pages long, and transcribed it into modernised English layout and format, so you can actually follow it. And it's a monumental piece of work. It's absolutely fabulous that he's done that. I started having to go at it myself years ago and gave up because it was just driving me nuts, but he's done it and it's brilliant. But coming on to that John Dee book, you've got a book at the moment which is actually quite fabulous, which I'd very much like to get my hands on as well. I'd say the original John Dee manuscripts were published in 1649. Was it 49?
1658, I think.
1658, and they sell now. The actual book will set you back £3,000 or £4,000. There was in the 1970s a reproduction, exact reproduction, produced, and it's absolutely beautiful in full leather binding, etc. And the paper is authentic of the time, styled paper and printed.
Yeah, and the tones of the inks and everything.
So
you know,
it looks
it's a a
absolutely
real
perfect
proper
copy.
facsimile.
Absolutely, and we have a mutual friend who's got a first edition, and I've been able to. I remember what it looked like, and looking at the one that British is selling at the moment, and it is perfect copy, it's brilliant. And you put it up for sale, and a small figure of what is it now?
I don't know yet because I haven't even really put it. It's not gone out yet. It'll go out on my next list, and I'm still umming and ahhing over the price. To be perfectly honest,
We're talking a few £100 though,
Yeah,
but yes,
yeah,
I'd love a
yeah.
copy of that myself. But that brings you on to one more little thing. I can't say too much at the moment, guys, because I'm still kind of negotiating the contract and deal, what have you. But I shall be having a book published in the fairly near future that is around John Dee and Enochian magic, and I'll say no more about it than that for now, because I am Call of Duty man to keep your gob shut until it's finalised with the publisher, but it should be coming out later on this year, and information and email basically confirming it's all going ahead today, so that will be interesting. Part of the reason why I talked to him about John Dee. But I think it's somebody that we'll have to come back to on the show, and I'll do a little talk about who John Dee was. He's an absolutely fascinating character. He may well have been a spy. He was certainly a mathematician and geometrist and sort of armchair explorer. He didn't really explore as such, but he was responsible for things like looking for the Northwest Passage, I remember, along those lines. He was
Yeah, and I mean, he also used to use a lot of local cunning men to actually go out and explore sort of sites that had come up in dispatches, as it were, from mediums like Kelly that he worked with, you know, sort of in their own local area. So
absolutely.
he was a bit of a treasure hunter, you might
Absolutely.
say.
One of those, quite a common thing with magic in those days, in 1500, was treasure hunting by psychic means. It comes back to almost psychic questing.
It does
basically.
really, yes, very, very similar. Very
Absolutely.
similar.
But the fascinating thing with John Dee for me was, and I know you as well, that he was very much a man of his times, wanted to learn all that was learnable and excelled in most sciences of the day. Now you're thinking, we're talking about the 1500s, so science and magic were kind of all tied together as one thing. There was no real set division that we have today. And his endeavour to learn more information about the world and the universe led him to try and directly communicate with angels. And he had a series of conversations over a number of years with various angelic entities via his medium and scryer Edward Kelly. And the book we were talking about, The True and Faithful Relation, is actually the transcription of those diary records of the communications with the angels as they identified themselves as being. Although I talk about it a bit in my book, but they're not Christian angels by any stretch of the imagination. Some of the things that they are claimed to have said to Dee makes it very clear they're not Christian. Certainly not. So.
Well, no, I mean, obviously, you know, the names that came through are certainly Judeo-Christian, but, you know, the nature of the actual spirits, as you said, Andy, you know, is probably a little bit more contentious.
If I can just pull up something, I can read out to you. These are part of what I've been working on, includes extracts from Dee's diaries, including the entries where the angelic forces, beings, whatever they are talking about what they say is the facts of Christianity. And let me just find the page. Give me a moment, chaps. I'm just scrolling through my book at the moment, which is on my screen, which you can't see yet. Will be out hopefully before the end of the year, possibly before the end of the summer. It is somewhere. I know it is. Give me 2 moments, guys. Waffle for yourself a sec. In typical fashion, I can't bloody find it. There you go. It's here somewhere. Because I use aspects of the papyrus, magical papyrus, from what I do in my book. I'm trying to combine elements of conventional or magic of the time with the Enochian material, trying to build a hybrid almost of the two. If I can find the bit I want, which is very annoying because it was quite interesting. Oh, here we are. During the angelic communications with Dee and Kelly, they were informed the following: that Jesus was not God, that no prayer ought to be made to Jesus, that there is no sin, that man doth go from one body to another like a child's quickening or animation, i.e. reincarnation. As many men and women as are now, there has always been. Now that's intriguing. So there's no rise. That is, that so many human bodies, souls, neither more or less than there are now, have always been. Now that, I'll reread that because it's really intriguing, because I've actually come across something that maybe reread that and think again about what it might be saying. Now I'll come back to it in a sec. What it says, again, I'll just read it as it says, that as many men and women as are now have always been. And this is direct words from these angels. That is, so many human bodies and souls, neither more nor less than there are now, have always been. Now, the only religion or faith-based idea that actually puts forward something along those lines is a Hindu system called Advaita Vedanta, which essentially says that we don't exist anyway, that we are just pure consciousness. That, not even that, we are just a pure existing energy. That the bodies that we inhabit aren't real at all. They're just like the shadows. They're not real in the sense of the sort of being is real. So you see what I'm saying? There's kind of a similarity there between the two concepts. Now, Advaita Vedanta itself actually came around about the same time. With Sankara was writing about the 6th century, but it was then reanimated as an idea in the 1600s. So it's quite interesting that there's something similar happening in India. A similar kind of concept was coming through. Some of the other things that they say, that the generation of mankind from Adam and Eve is not historical, but was written as if in another sense. So it's actually saying, now you've got to think, in the 1600s, the idea that Adam and Eve were not real would be quite shocking.
Yes.
It wasn't real until Darwin put that idea forward some centuries later. So, but they have these Enochian beings saying 200, 300 years before, certainly 200 years before Darwin or anyone around that kind of period was saying the same kind of thing, that Adam and Eve are not real. They are just mythological. There is no Holy Ghost. I'm not sure what it means by that necessarily. And they should suffer him not to pray to Jesus Christ, but rebuke him, saying that he has robbed God of his honour. Now, again, it's sort of saying that Christ isn't really a manifestation of God at all. So some of that certainly sounds more like Judaism. The idea that, you know, this Christ figure is actually just isn't the real one at all.
Because obviously, you know, Judaism does not acknowledge, you know, sort of Christ as a Messiah. So
absolutely. So that's the only tie-in I could find there, really, with that. But it's interesting if you delve into the manuscripts and see what's actually being said. There is some very interesting things coming out from something that was essentially in the late 1500s. That appears to have been transcribed from angelic communications. Now, you need to really read some more of the stuff to get a sense of what's going on, but the system itself is complex, isn't it? We can agree on that. Part of it included a series of kind of poems in a sense, but they're kind of apocalyptical kind of prophecies as well. And then there's this series of communications of how to communicate with these angelic beings. It's spoken in a complete unknown language, which is being called Enochian, but that was later on. I know Dean never called it Enochian himself.
No, he
language
didn't.
of the angels, isn't
Yeah,
it?
and obviously there is no, you know, sort of historical Book of Enoch, you know, known at that time.
That's what I was coming on to, absolutely. Yeah, there was no Book of Enoch, but there was subsequently, I think it was in Ethiopia, wasn't it, that the first Book of Enoch actually turned up. So there really was a Book of Enoch. Now, what's in the D manuscripts is not the same as what's in the Book of Enoch, but the Enochian angels' information, it's saying in this other language, but you can translate it. And I know that the actual information was given backwards, one letter at a time. So you've got this communication of spirit energy to a medium who is then telling D, who's writing it down, one letter at a time, backwards. And when you transcribe it from the Enochian language into English, it is actual proper words. Now, there's no way on earth anyone could just invent that system and come up with it off the top of their head.
Well, it's certainly, the odds are against it. It's exceptionally difficult to actually invent a language as quick as that has its own syntax, grammar, and actually makes sense.
Because it had to be transcribed over 40 days, didn't it?
Yes.
40 days, and that was it. So it took about 6 weeks or so. And Sue's asking, will my book be available on Man, Myth and Magic? Probably not unless you get a second-hand copy. Unfortunately, Richard deals only in new. Although, funny enough, I was talking to Mandy earlier today, maybe we might see if that's possible. We can get some copies for you to sell through you, maybe get a bit more profit on top. I don't know, we're something we can talk to the publisher about. It's all very hush-hush at the moment, Suze. I can't say too much more about it, but it looks like it's definitely going ahead. Richard will have it if it comes out second-hand. So otherwise, I mean, I can put you in contact with the supplier, and I'm sure we can get hold of it quite easily. But yeah, so that's really my news as well about my own book. But certainly, so try and summarise an interest in magic is not the easiest thing in the world to do, because it's just a vast, huge subject. Some areas that would have been regarded as magic 200 years ago would be seen as science today.
Science has been gradually catching up with magic, in my opinion, over the years. And now with breakthroughs in things like quantum physics and quantum theory, is now explaining from a scientific viewpoint why magic works.
Absolutely, yeah. It shows that nothing is what it seems like. Absolutely nothing at all. Objects are not solid at all.
Exactly.
They are just
going back to what you were saying about Advaita Vedanta, it's making sense of that as well. Absolutely, from a scientific viewpoint.
Again, the Advaita Vedanta talks about us being basically pure energy, and what we know certainly from physics now is that matter and energy, there is no separation. Matter is just very, very condensed energy. And ultimately, the lowest, the smallest level, we are just energy waves, and there's no separation between me and the thing next to me. It's just an illusion. There's some voice in it. An illusion. Let's see, any more questions in the old chatty room over there? Anyone who's got any more questions, please do put them in. Anything particular that you'd like to know more about yourself when it comes to the occult that you would like to? What are you kind of researching and working on yourself at the moment? That you can talk about.
Well, researching at the moment a book on Kenneth Grant for a publisher in America, which is in the process of being written at the moment. I also did an article for an in memoriam sort of collection of essays that he put out, which has sadly already gone out of print. So that's my main sort of area, which strangely enough is looking into a lot of the concepts we've just been discussing, like Advaita Vedanta, which was core to Grant's own, sort of magical system as well. Probably more so than the influence from people like Crowley, which is more talked about.
Absolutely. I mean, just to cover basically, Kenneth Grant was the sort of kind of the founder, really, because it's a bit of a complex story, isn't it, basically, but he ran a version of the organisations that Crowley had set up or had taken over.
Yes, I mean, it was all a bit contentious, the fact that sort of Grant set up the Typhonian OTO, which is a branch of the Ordo Templi Orientis, but then you've got the Caliphate OTO in America, which basically said nobody else can call their organisations OTO, so therefore Grant's own became the Typhonian Order, but he still founded more or less on the same kind of principles, looking into a lot of stuff what Crowley looked into, Eastern mysticism, sexual magic and things like that as a basis for it.
It's, again, a lot of people tend to come across Aleister Crowley or Crowley first of all when they get into the occult. He's probably the most visible figure, shall we say. But he's one of those chaps that I think his publicity is such that it belies the real person behind it. I think if you certainly read any of his magical writings, it's not this demonic, beastly, baby-eating monster that he's often portrayed in the media, is he? It's,
No, I mean, let's not beat about the bush. I mean, Crowley wasn't a particularly nice man. I mean, he was, terrible attitude to women, total misogynist, didn't treat people very well. But at the end of the day, he was an incredible occultist, and he did actually relish the fact that he was seen as the wickedest man in the he did play up to that. He loved the fact that the media turned him as such, that he was that most evil man in the world, and he played up to that that archetype.
So you believe of any publicity is good publicity, no matter how bad.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I mean, we do have certain things to thank him for. It was down to him that the Golden Dawn, who was probably the biggest instigator of the rebirth of modern occultism, actually their material became readily available to the public, because it was all very secret at first, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I know that Crowley published a lot of their material in his series of books called, it's a magazine basically, The Equinox, and that the whole thing went to court in the end, but because the Golden Dawn had never actually copyrighted their material, then there was nothing to stop Crowley publishing it.
No, exactly. I mean, if you take, sort of Crowley's Book of Correspondences, 777, I mean, that's pillaged wholesale from Mathers. MacGregor Mathers, who was obviously, one of the leading knights of the Golden Dawn.
If there'd been no
and two of them had a magical battle.
Absolutely, yeah. Had there been no Golden Dawn, there'd be no Wicca movement, there'd be no modern rebirth of occultism at all, really. I mean, the spiritualist movement came around about the same time, which I'd say I'm a
little earlier, really.
Well, I suppose they were earlier, but the popularity of things like the Theosophical Society was still the late 1800s, wasn't it? That was when it
late 1800s.
That was kind of an explosion of interest. There was the kind of airy, very mystical side, like the theosophical, and the more kind of practical not day to day, I suppose the more practical magic, I suppose, of the Golden Dawn.
I mean, although that was probably precursored by, the studies of Levi and people like that.
Yeah,
Oh,
Levi, definitely, yeah.
And the fact that, there was another, sort of proto-Golden Dawn order called the Order of Eight, which not a lot is known about, which, sort of was formed, and kind of out of the ashes of that came, what we know as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which I think was formed in 1888.
Yeah, absolutely. Seen Jack Ripple's running around doing his things.
Yeah, strange enough.
No connection, I have to emphasise, and we've had that discussion before about the occult and Jack the Ripper, no link whatsoever. But the other one that chap interests me particularly is a guy called Frederick Hockley, who, had he lived, would certainly have been a major light of the Golden Dawn. Unfortunately, died kind of about the same time they were founding them. And he may well have been responsible for a lot of their early material. I mean, I know there's...
Undoubtedly he was. He was a member of the Order of Eight, supposedly.
Yeah. I didn't know that. Okay. Because I know he's probably... Because the Golden Dawn was supposedly based around this manuscript that was found inside a book that was bought in Portobello that was based on a German organisation. Now, any attempt to find the German, because of Dummerung and German Golden Dawn, they don't exist. They never have existed. There's no trace of them. And it's been suggested that what it was actually found is actually written by Hockley. Exactly. The cipher manuscripts with the foundation of the Golden Dawn rituals was probably at least co-written by Hockley, I believe. And Hockley's always fascinated me, and a lot of his material was unavailable for years, but there's gradually more and more of his books are being published, which is fantastic. And there's one of his I haven't got, which I missed unfortunately. It was Experimentum, which is a very limited edition, very expensive book. But most of his other material I managed to acquire over the last few years. So I'm very pleased with that myself. But we have our joint interest area really is the sort of folklore magic, isn't it?
It is really traditional folk magic of of this country, really.
Yeah, which is seeing some of a resurgence. A lot of books are popping up. I mean, I'd say that Cholmondeley is partly responsible for its rebirth. But
undoubtedly,
other writers that deserve credit are people like Jim McGarry, whose books have come out from Troy Books more recently, has perpetuated and kept the interest moving forward and keeping it divided from the Wicca field, which is, I mean, it's not a problem, but I think it's like Catholicism versus Protestantism. If you're a Christian, you're one or the other. You don't necessarily believe both. Well, no, obviously ideas cross over, but you wouldn't see yourself in both camps. And I think it's not a Wicca versus traditional. It's not a versus, but it's an alternative. And I think it's in a funny way where Gerald Gardner wanted to make his authentic historic organisation, which clearly it's not. The traditional witchcraft itself, proper folk magic, has got a tradition to it, a history to it. So again, it's kind of scattered around with various texts, but there's a kind of traceable line. But by the same token, someone who calls them a traditional witch is not necessarily going to worry about having generations of connection with historic witchcraft in their family from decades back.
Well, no, and I mean, sort of historical studies like, sort of Owen Davis's book on, sort of cunning folk has shown that rarely, if someone was a cunning man in their family, or a witch or whatever you want to term it, it rarely lasted more than a couple of generations. The next person would get fed up and think, oh, I'm not going to practice that or whatever, and it would just, as far as a family tradition, go by the by.
Absolutely.
And I think, at least, sort of a lot of the modern practitioners, Gemma Gary, like you've mentioned, is not trying to establish some huge personal lineage, but merely saying this is the folk magic of where I live in Cornwall, and these are the sources where it comes from, and it's a revitalising of an old tradition rather than something which they're trying to establish a lineage which doesn't exist to.
Absolutely.
Which sadly has been the problems with Wicca and a lot of the other lineages, probably, Planetubal Cane being another case.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that was a kind of alternative to Wicca that was sort of established itself in the 60s. There was, the Planetubal Cane and Robert Cochrane, who was
Roy Bowers.
The real name, Roy Bowers. Which is, I don't know why Robert Cochrane just sounds as Roy Bowers myself. I don't know why he changed it, but I'd have found something more magical than that. But it was kind of seen it I think it was part of the founding of, or the refounding of traditional witchcraft comes from there. But as we've discovered, it was a bollocks basically. He was even worse than Gerald Gardner for just making stuff up.
I think the problem was that a lot of these people tried to establish a lineage behind what they were saying to give it some kind of extra gravitas, but sadly when you examine the lineages of these things, as far as personal verifiable connections are concerned, they just don't exist.
Absolutely not.
And most of the material from which the traditions are drawn, a lot of it is purely 20th century or 19th at best.
Absolutely. When we go back to Colin Monroe we were talking about earlier on, I mean, I don't think he would ever claim any lineage as such. It's
No,
kind of popped out
he was there. You know, he didn't come. Although he was supposedly the seventh son of a seventh son, which is a traditional sort of magical thing to be born. He was not from a family of cunning folk. I mean, his family weren't practitioners of magic at all.
No. I know from his one of his sons, he had many children. One son grew up and tried to follow in his footsteps.
He did indeed,
and
yes. Yeah,
created
Edward or
things,
Buck Merrill,
yeah. Created things called the witch bottles, iron witch bottles at the blacksmith local blacksmith used to forge for Cunning Merrill. Now I would imagine that they were probably forged badly, deliberately, so that they would break easily. Because one of the ways of breaking a spell was you'd put the witch bottle on a fire.
I don't think that's the case. I don't think they were badly forged, because obviously if you've got something which is metal and got a stopper in it and you heat it on a fire, eventually, providing it is airtight, it is going to explode. That's obviously what happened.
But I would imagine it would break relatively easily, and I think the one that Buckmore had made to try and follow his father's footsteps was rather too well made or too well sealed, because when that exploded, it blew half the house down, didn't it?
Yeah, blew the side of his cottage off, basically.
So kind of wrecked it.
That was his first and only sort of, venture into his father's footsteps, really.
Yeah, absolutely, because the idea was you'd create this witch bottle to try and break a witch's spell, because cunning men were like battled witches, basically. They weren't witches themselves, were they? They were like
No, I mean, ever since, the 16th century and this, sort of 17th century and this change in the law, I think that, there was this divergence between folk witches and cunning folk. That cunning folk would get away with what they were doing because it was professed to be under the auspices of God and his angels rather than the devil, which is what witches were traditionally associated with.
Absolutely.
But to be honest, prior to that time, they were probably the same kind of people.
Oh yeah, interchangeable. Really,
the root is interchangeable at the end of the day.
I think it's probably for purposes of sort of legal protection, he would be perceived or would want to be seen as someone who's breaking witches' spells, because witches were supposed to be the baddies. But yeah, I mean, so there's an arbitrary line between the two, if it exists at all, really. So
exactly,
quite nonsensical.
It's another one of those grey areas, just like black and white magic.
Absolutely. I think we're probably going to wrap things up in a little while, actually. Just trying to think if anyone's got any more questions. I'm just going to ask if anyone's got any more questions before we start wrapping things up. And a few people stayed with us, which is quite nice. I mean, I hope we haven't lost too many in our kind of ramblings about the occult, but it's one of those subjects that, it is.
Yeah, we are both sober, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you've kind of both been involved for many years, you kind of find yourself kind of advanced knowledge and talking about stuff that people think, what the fuck are we on about? Because we know what we're talking about. Other people might be wondering, but hopefully we've given some people a bit of an insight, certainly into the psychic questing stuff earlier on. I think that was quite fascinating. I know people have asked before what that's all about, because I've mentioned it previously, so it's good to talk about that, and then talk briefly about books, and then a kind of a general overview of Western occultism, really. And
we've crammed quite a bit in, I think.
Absolutely, in the space of the last 2 hours. Well, I know usually we wrap up things with the news reports and this and that, but I did find a couple, but I can't be bothered really, not too exciting. Trying to find sort of occult-based news stories. Apparently, just following on from one I mentioned last week, that the Vatican are now offering courses in how to train to become an exorcist. I remember saying before, because of the peripheral, all these films of vampires and werewolves, where they seem to be the goodies and not being too bad, and that kids are kind of following in the footsteps of this sort of stuff, that people are having to now turn to the Vatican to be protected by these things. Yeah, Vatican's exorcism course aims come amid growing interest in the occult. Okay, right, so the Vatican was holding a course about exorcism this week amid the burgeoning interest in the practice and the occult in general, according to one of the organisers. We have held this course for the last 10 years, and the numbers of those wanting to attend keep growing, said Giuseppe Ferrari. Essentially it's the same thing as I said last week, but there are actually proper courses now being run about it. It's all about because of the interest in True Blood and Twilight and that kind of thing. Last year they had 50 students, so this year they had 50, and this year we have 200 people from 30 countries all wanting to attend. The Vatican's course, Exorcism and Prayer for Liberation, provides the tools needed to cast demonic spirits from human hosts, according to the official website. The 6-day event, ending in Saturday whenever, I don't know, also aims to teach practitioners how to distinguish real demonic possession from mental illness and cult worship. To that. I don't think any 6-day...
Best of luck.
Yeah, absolutely. Any 6-day course can teach you how to identify mental illness is having a laugh. As I'm going to preview a bit of my actual article now. Saying it's like saying to somebody that you go to a friend and say, "I'm pain in my stomach." Your friend says, "I read a book about appendices. Maybe your appendix needs to come out. Shall I operate for you?" You know, having read one book on the subject, it's not a good idea. But yes, I thought that was rather amusing. The other one was about some village that's supposed to be involved in witchcraft in America, but I can't be bothered with that. We usually finish up with what do we normally finish up the show with? I can't even remember. My head's melted now after talking so long. Steve's asking, why do you think there are so many grey areas? Not sure what you mean, Steve. I mean, magic is grey all over, really.
Well, it's probably a lot of answers to that. I mean, religious and cultural conditioning.
Absolutely.
People's own moral perceptions of things. I think really that's probably a discussion we go on for another half an hour.
Absolutely,
sadly, so.
It's one of those things, I think, that because it's surrounded in so much baloney, basically, the occult, that people tend to see it as something dark and sinister. But naturally, as mentioned only last week, I think the occult just means hidden. It's not immediately obvious. It's esoteric knowledge versus... probably the biggest division comes down to the idea of knowledge against faith.
Yep.
Traditional Western religions, Christianity obviously being the main one, are faith-based. They don't like you questioning, do they? They don't like you exploring. The occult is about knowledge, it's about exploring, it's about understanding, and these things stand opposed to each other because faith, unfortunately, is seen as being the only true way to, quotations, God, but then that depends what you define as being God. I mean, as someone who follows the Advaita Vedanta, this is God, the whole universe, we're all God. It's all one thing. It's all Brahman, so I don't have a problem with that.
Well, or as Crowley said, every man and woman is a star. It kind of fits in with that as well, even though...
We're all made of stardust. Yeah. We're all billions and billions of years old already. So I'm going to say nighty-night. Next week, we have got a guest. I can't remember what the bloody hell it is. Some Dr. Love, I think was the name.
Dr. Love?
Yes, it's got something to do with the supernatural as well. I'm quite sure of it. I must admit I've completely forgotten. But if you do check on the old website and the KTPF Facebook page, the information will appear there very shortly. Well, this does just about wrap it up for tonight. It's been a wonderful evening. I've really enjoyed chatting away with my friend Richard here and discussing various topics, so including the psychic questioning at the start of the show and finishing off with the occult more generally tonight. Also want to thank everybody who came into the chat room to ask a few questions, although one or two names I recognise very well indeed, who are usual co-hosts asking the appropriate questions, which is very good. But also thanks to everybody else who had questions or observations and wonder what on earth was going on and where the hub had disappeared to tonight. But next week we'll be back to normal with Steve and Sue in the hub and myself after here in Essex Land on Skype. So all it leaves me to say now is good night, and as always, keep the paranormal and the occult friendly. Good night.
To see in the night, to measure the spike, to see how cold it's been. I buy my kit so I won't forget the ghosties that I have seen. The Paranormal Intelligence Gathering Services Ghost Store. So visit www.the-pigs.co.uk/ghost store.